The fair-haired guy stood in the bathroom and peered intently into the mirror, unable to realize that it was him in the reflection. The reflection was a real person named James, who did not understand who was standing in front of him and was amazed at their extraordinary resemblance. Thoughts became confused. The fictitious personality mixed with the real one, and the boundaries between them became blurred. Finally, the thought and memory flashed through James's head that in front of him was the heir of the great Granfell clan, Claudie Arfe Romeo. This man was a character that James had created 12 years earlier, during his second year of high school. Romeo, according to the boy's idea, was a demon hunter. He was a strong and proud descendant of noble gentry. The boy seemed to be trying to come up with the best version of himself that he wanted to be born as. This character was not complex or multifaceted. He was a manifestation of megalomania and was a collective image of a strong fighter against evil. Romeo was created to be a character in a popular and even legendary virtual reality game about another world. However, on the day the game closed, its creator mysteriously disappeared and no one knew where he went or why he left the project without saying anything. With the news of the company's CEO's disappearance, his game, Arcana, became part of reality. Monsters began to emerge from rifts all over the world, and the existence of humanity was threatened. But along with the monsters came people who were in sync with their characters. These people were called players, and they could use unusual super skills to defeat monsters and save the world. As a child, James admired these players and dreamed of becoming such a brave and famous hero. However, he already realized that even with the awakening of his powers, he would not be as popular, and his family's financial situation did not allow him to purchase a virtual reality machine. James's father failed at work and his business went bankrupt. His mother did not have much money but supported her husband. In an attempt to find a better life and new opportunities, James had no choice but to join the game. Less than a year had passed since the main character awakened. But to his misfortune, he awakened into the character he had created back in school. Granfell Cloudy Arpheus Romeo was an over-the-top evil fighter with a tragic backstory. It seemed that nothing foreshadowed trouble. But suddenly, one fateful day at a ball, all of Romeo's relatives became victims of the demon and only he managed to survive. Left alone, he decided to become a demon hunter and take revenge on every bloodthirsty monster for his family. During his school days, James seriously considered Romeo to be his second personality. James was in a panic. He had no idea how to continue his routine activities in a new guise and with a new character. Even the thoughts James was thinking seemed completely different to him from those Romeo was expressing out loud. Most players reported that the changes after synchronization were very minimal. James decided that it would be better not to go to work like this. Otherwise, he would have to become a player, and he decided to start by searching for information about the game. There was a lot of information on the internet, but it was all the same and stated that high-class fighters received large sums of money for eliminating gaps. The situation was difficult and dangerous, but Romeo was not afraid of it. He was ready to accept the challenge and cope with any difficulties that would arise on his way. First, it was necessary to find out what the demon hunters were doing now. The strange thing was that there was very little information on this matter, and it was all just news. One of the articles stated that all the demon hunters in Akshan City were killed and there were 0 survivors, which is why there is so little information about this class. However, few people chose them for play, as they had low stats and were difficult to level up, and their skill level had to be raised through daily quests. The only thing they were incomparably better at than other classes was fighting demons. In the game, the role of the demon hunter seemed unclear and poorly understood, and the class itself raised doubts about its usefulness and effectiveness. James was wondering what to do next, since there were few demon-slaying missions and no one to train him with yet. On one of the websites, a user wrote about a new update that was added to the game, which included new demons. Demons now appear among regular monsters. Their abilities have been enhanced, including mind corruption and possession. James began to wonder why the other demon hunters hadn't dealt with them, and if he was the only hunter left. The protagonist didn't know whether to intervene and stop the synchronization for his own safety. But then he heard his inner voice from childhood, which called him weak. Little James claimed that no demonic temptations, trials, or deceptions could hurt Romeo's pride or stand in his way. An inner voice convinced James to continue the merger and encouraged him to continue the fight. With the new update, the number of victims increased significantly, with the bodies of innocent victims of circumstances lying all over the streets. Seeing this, a memory of his family flashed through Romeo's mind, and he then promised that he would personally send every demon to hell. Several years have passed since the Great Cataclysm. Many things were lost, but people were able to get back on their feet. The streets are alive again, and everyone has adapted to the new world. But evil never sleeps and is always nearby. The negative emotions of the newly gathered people became excellent food for the demons. The leader of the battle group, clad in heavy armor, eagerly awaited the arrival of all members of his team. Romeo, full of confidence, was rapidly approaching the group, although he was a little late for the start of the team meeting. The team captain introduced himself and introduced Romeo to the group as a new member. The guy's gaze fell on a translucent lilac portal, which the players called a rift. It is visible only to players. Ordinary people cannot interact with the rift in any way. Romeo learned that this portal is suitable for players with levels between 35 and 40, which is exactly what suits him at level 55. When he searched for information, he learned that the average level of those attacking rifts is 200, and to reach such heights, the protagonist still needs to work hard. Luckily, not everyone awakens at a high level, so Romeo was able to find a suitable team consisting of the tank Hank, the melee attacker Sam, and the sorceress Bella. The group leader Jack said that another group had already gone into the rift and that they needed to follow in 5 minutes. Romeo, despite his excitement and wariness before the fight, tried not to show his emotions to the rest of the team. Although he was worried about the degree of destruction of the portal, if the degree of resolution reached 100%, all the monsters would break through the rift into the real world. Jack ordered everyone to gather and asked if everyone was ready to move out, to which the team members unanimously agreed. Everyone was so friendly, so James wanted to say something encouraging. So Romeo told the team that they had nothing to worry about because he was with them. The team passed through the portal and found themselves inside an abandoned warehouse. It was suspiciously quiet around. Not a single monster or person, although another team had come here before. Romeo, sensing that something was wrong, began to look around cautiously, ready for any surprises. Suddenly, blood-red eyes of gnolls appeared from the darkness, preparing to attack the team. Jack, the team captain, was the first to rush into battle, straight into the thick of the battle. Romeo watched the proceedings from the sidelines and assessed the team's chances of winning. The main character stood aside because at this moment in the battle his abilities were useless. As he stood there, deciding which weapon to use in battle, an arrow was fired out of nowhere, straight at him. It turned out that in the most inconspicuous place behind the pillars, there was an ambush of a huge number of fighters who were now eager to fight. The team, caught off guard, quickly began to take up defensive positions, while Jack fled the battlefield, cowardly abandoning his team at the most difficult moment of the battle. Sam, beside himself with rage, shouted at the captain that he must go back and help them hold the line. Because Sam was distracted, he didn't look around at all, and an enemy was rushing towards him from behind at breakneck speed. Time seemed to stand still as the arrow flew past the boy's face and pierced the attacking monster right in the back. To everyone's surprise, it was Romeo who came to the rescue in a difficult situation. The battle was in full swing. The monsters were attacking from all sides. Hank fought bravely, but despite this, 2 monsters managed to slip past him. 2 bloodthirsty monsters, brandishing swords, rushed towards the helplessly standing witch, who was unable to move from the spot out of horror. Bella, paralyzed with fear, did not know where to run or what to do. Her mind was clouded. Romeo appeared behind the sorceress, calming her down by telling her that he would deal with the intruders and ordering her to use the most powerful spell she knew. The arrow fired by the hunter hit the target right on target, stopping the monsters. Sam continued to hold his ground, protecting the sorceress who was preparing to deal a powerful blow to her opponents. Bella was ready to cast the spell and ordered her allies to scatter to the sides. Streams of fire burst from the sorceress's hands, striking all the attackers. Then the streams of fire turned into an explosion that finished off the remaining monsters. Romeo, noticing that Bella was scared, advised her to help her allies while he himself inspected the battlefield. The sorceress, grateful for the support, nodded and ran to help her friends. The protagonist, looking at the corpses of his enemies and the arrows lying next to them, wondered whether he could use them again. After the fight, Bella gave the healing potion to Hank, but Sam didn't need it. Filled with rage, he couldn't contain his emotions. But suddenly, from the gloomy darkness of the long corridor, as if nothing had happened, the figure of Jack appeared, who, apparently, did not at all realize the seriousness of the situation. Sam, in a rage, attacked the captain and began accusing him of being a vile coward who had abandoned the crew. To everyone's surprise, Jack began to laugh uncontrollably and terribly. Sam, who had expected a completely different reaction from the captain, began to blame him even more furiously for what had happened. The captain's gaze was full of madness. He began to insult the crew, calling them funny and stupid. Romeo, noticing strange details in Jack's behavior, began to suspect that he might not be who he claimed to be. By all indications, the hero was facing a demon of incredible strength and power. The demon's eyes glowed blood red. He smirked, and with contempt in his voice confirmed Romeo's fears. The team was confused and couldn't understand what was happening. They didn't know how to react to the situation and what to do next. Hank couldn't believe his eyes and ears and refused to believe that there was a demon in front of him. But suddenly the team disappeared from sight and darkness formed around him. And suddenly Hank heard terrifying sounds from his team, and turning back, he saw a terrible picture. Bella, covered in blood, stretched out her hands to him and begged for help. The demon who had arranged all this grinned, rejoicing at his victory and the weakness of his allies' mental resistance. Romeo, full of determination and courage, without wasting a minute, decided to attack the demon. He ran and struck his opponent in the chest with his blade, but the armor was unable to deal damage to the demon. The demon, with a sly grin on his face, warned that the damage inflicted on him could kill the possessed person. Romeo was not at all surprised by this, as he was prepared and was only calculating the next steps in the duel. In an attempt to penetrate the armor and find a weak spot in it, he struck another blow to the enemy's back. This action did not produce much result, as the armor was incredibly strong. However, as a result of this attack, the protagonist's fighting power increased during the battle. The demon launched a counterattack, but Romeo was able to dodge without taking any damage. The demon, feeling invincible, recklessly relaxed and received a dagger in the face. Romeo found a spot unprotected by the armor and used his blade to cut the demon's face. A black, viscous substance immediately gushed from the possessed man's eyes, indicating that severe damage had been inflicted. The demon fell to his knees and began to writhe in pain, because the dagger turned out to be silver, the most dangerous weapon against demons. Romeo, towering over the demon, mockingly ordered him to continue fighting and not to whine. Something happened inside the demon, as Jack began to struggle outward, trying to remember how he fell under the demon's influence. Just a couple of months ago, after another battle, Jack was sitting at home and talking with his brother Christoph. Christoph was worried about his brother, who had received many injuries after the last battle, and suggested that he give up this business. Passers-by on the street, noticing Jack, asked him only about his brother and his exploits. This really hurt him because he didn't want to be a loser and just wanted to be someone his brother could be proud of. Because of these fears and self-doubt, the demon chose Jack as his prey. Jack did not understand what was happening and who was in front of him. He tried his best to resist the unprecedented force, but he was weaker. The demon swallowed the young man, and all he could do was watch the demon's actions. Jack watched as the demon tricked the group into a trap that would lead them to certain death. He could not look at this calmly and tried in every way to drive out the demon and wake up, but it was all in vain. But a sudden, sharp jolt knocked Jack's consciousness out, and he realized that liberation was near. The demon was in a panic. He tried to deceive Romeo that he would kill Jack along with him. But this is not the first time the protagonist has encountered demons and their insidious tricks. He knows their behavior and senses lies. Taking advantage of the demon's distraction, Jack pins him down, preventing him from moving before the decisive blow. Romeo deals the weakened demon the final and most powerful blow. The demon screams at the top of his lungs, and with the scream, Jack breaks free, and the demon disappears forever. The guy falls straight onto his back, completely exhausted after a long struggle. Having finally come to his senses, he is horrified by what happened to him, and he is also overcome by a wave of shame and regret that he let him in at all. The team of players surrounds their captain, and they are all genuinely worried about his well-being. Romeo brings him back to reality by reminding him of his words before the battle that the team is fine as long as he is with them. The protagonist urged the team, who were listening to him attentively, not to forget their pride and to stop fearing demons, as this emotion fueled their strength. Romeo then began to check his inventory, but after the battle with the demon, nothing important or necessary fell out. Sometime later, when Jack got home, he showed his brother an article on the internet about the battle that had just happened, which spoke of a powerful member of the team who had saved a possessed man. Jack asked his brother to take this man into the guild since he saved his life. Christoph, a high-level guild leader, was stunned by the news of his brother's possession. Christoph was even more surprised that his brother agreed to the position of analyst on his team, although he had previously refused at all costs. Jack, with a noticeable mischief in his voice, threw the accusation at his brother, declaring that he did not believe him. However, he was absolutely serious about his intention to become an analyst, as he realized his limitations and a more suitable role on the team. Christoph listened attentively to his brother's thoughts about rethinking his life, and was extremely curious about the kind of person who had such an influence on him. He then began to think about who the person could be, since his mental resistance turned out to be very high, since he did not succumb to the demon's attacks. He also used a dagger as a weapon rather than magic, which is not typical of any of the classes he knew. Jack was about to give evidence that this was not a made-up story, but his brother interrupted him and said that he believed him. And to support him, Christophe reminded him that it was Jack who helped him become who he is today. That is why, without thinking, Christophe drew up a contract for the new member and brought it to his brother for approval. These warm and sincere words made Jack feel awkward, and he thanked her shyly. Christophe offered to look at the contents of the contract and make his recommendations on this matter. After reading all the terms of cooperation, Jack's eyes widened in surprise. After the fight with the demon, Romeo's level increased significantly by as much as 12 points, which was extremely unexpected. Romeo didn't care much about such trifles, while James was delighted and was already calculating what he could spend the points on. Next, James planned to rest in bed, while Romeo had completely different plans. Having noticed just one speck of dust, he started a general cleaning, as he hated dust and dirt. After he finished cleaning, he, not feeling tired, decided to cook dinner. Watching Romeo from the side, James realized that in addition to levels and characteristics, the character settings that he himself set as a child were also applied. Then it was necessary to find out what talents Romeo was endowed with. The main character had such a talent for magic that he could repeat any spell after one demonstration and had good physical potential. Looking back on his childhood notes, James realized he had written only positive qualities, such as intelligence, a talent for magic, and a good body. The protagonist decided to check whether these attitudes influence real life, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by an unknown message. The message turned out to be from Jack. It was very long. It said that he recommended him to the first guild of the country and thanked him for saving him. Romeo decided to decline the offer, as he was currently focused on something completely different. He then proceeded to test his abilities and began with video lessons on magic. Jack and Christophe did not expect Romeo to refuse their offer, and both were completely surprised. Jack suggested that perhaps the guy had already received a more lucrative offer from another guild. Christophe was furious. He didn't understand which other guild could offer more favorable conditions. Then Jack began to explain that it could be one of the companies in the city center. But Christophe, unable to contain his emotion, shouted that no one dared to enter his territory. The analyst continued to reflect on how, after the appearance of the magic tower in the city center, numerous offices of foreign guilds began to open around it. Christophe roared that there was no way any local guild could offer better terms than he did. Christophe was not going to give up and decided to go to Romeo personally. But before that, he needed to find out the details of the guy's appearance. Jack frantically tried to put together a complete description of the hunter's appearance, but the only thing that came to his mind was his wise appearance. Then a clear and concise description of the guy flashed through Jack's mind. He looked like an aristocrat from a fantasy world. After testing his magical abilities, it became clear that Romeo understood the fundamental principles of magic and could cast any spell that suited his rank. James was delighted with the results, to be honest. He didn't expect anything else from Romeo. After testing his new knowledge, James finally decided to get to work on distributing points. He spent 2 points on strength and dexterity, 7 on magical abilities, and 1 on luck. Romeo was in complete calm. He was getting ready for bed and looking at his new characteristics. Suddenly, unexpectedly, he heard the sound of a bell, which meant that he had received notification of a new task. After Arcana's appearance in reality, quests became very rare, as there were few non-player characters. The protagonist was surprised, since even ordinary tasks were rare, but he was immediately given a class task. The class assignment was extremely rare in the game, as it was given to only one person from the entire class. This task was not available to low-level players. Only the best of the best were given this opportunity. Romeo was lost in memories of his training as a hunter at the legendary Akshan base. The reality turned out to be completely different, as the city was in a deplorable state. Many buildings were destroyed, the roads were broken, and the streets were littered with garbage. The training began with a strange task that had nothing to do with hunting training. The instructor ordered us to climb a cliff to its top. While everyone who came was trying to climb the rock, the instructor managed to reproach the inexperienced players. Having finally climbed up with difficulty, the students received a new, even wilder task. They had to go down. But Romeo was not angry about what happened, as he believed that the hunter needed training that would make his mind stronger to fight demons. However, all this was in the past, and now it was necessary to first see what the meaning of the quest was. To deal with the chaos and damage that followed Arcana's emergence into reality, an association of former game developers was formed. They respond to every update that is reflected in the real world, collecting and analyzing information for players. The employees of this company are constantly working overtime and overtime. The workers were waiting for the latest update, which was about to be released from the developer Raymond, who was doing everything alone. The pattern was that as soon as an update appeared on the site, reality immediately changed. And then, at the very end of the working day, when no one expected it, a new update appeared. The company's employees were shocked by what the update brought to their system. They did not expect such serious innovations and were not prepared for them. The update introduced new monsters of incredible power, a new rift, and most terrifying of all, a new level 430 vampire demon. The staff began to discuss that there was no group or single fighter who could defeat the demon. One of them concluded that this was an impossible task and that this update threatened the extinction of all humanity. The second employee didn't want to believe that the main developer would do something like this to destroy everyone. The worker couldn't quite comprehend that this was actually happening, as previous updates had been manageable, but this was destroying the balance and now only a miracle would help. Romeo's quest today was as useless but difficult as in Arcana, requiring him to perform various physical exercises many times a day. These exercises were difficult because I was not used to them, and after doing them my whole body ached and shook. However, James received satisfaction from the fact that all the tasks were completed and all the boxes were ticked. Today's quest was finally over, and Romeo, with a calm soul and a sense of accomplishment, fell asleep in anticipation of a new task. But the next day, to the protagonist's utter disappointment, the task remained the same. James was beside himself with anger, as he was once again faced with the same tasks. A whole week passed, but the quest did not change. When one was completed, a new one appeared next, and so on in a circle. After another completed training session, Romeo sat tired and covered in sweat, while James wondered when he would finally receive his reward. And then, out of the blue, Romeo's stats get a 2-point boost to strength and agility, even though it takes millions to increase them even just 1 point. This news pleased James, because if this was a repeating quest, then it would most likely appear constantly and it would be completely worth the effort. Romeo overheard a conversation about a new update coming from 2 elderly women sitting nearby. The protagonist was shocked that after this update, most guilds refused to take part in the raid on the rift. When Romeo got home, the first thing he did was check the news. He listened with a calm expression to the news about the appearance of a new high-ranking demon. However, James wasn't so calm. All he cared about was the demon's level 430. The news said that because the demon was level 430, large guilds expressed their desire not to participate in the upcoming raid, which was associated with enormous risks. James was scared because demons are the hardest for regular players to deal with, because no matter how strong you are, you still have to deal with constant negative effects during the fight. What scared James most was the new demon, Count Oscura, whom he couldn't even imagine fighting. But there was nowhere to go as a new task was approaching, a vampire hunt. Romeo was absolutely ready for this mission and nothing scared him. He just wanted to punish these vile creatures. Judging by the results of the search, the possessions of Count Oscura were located in Concord, so in order to get there, it was necessary to first go to the magic tower. Inside the tower is a portal created through large-scale magic that allows the user to travel anywhere. Romeo, without wasting a minute, immediately began to get ready for the journey in order to be the first to get to the tower. James warned that it was winter in Concord and the weather was extremely harsh, so it was necessary to wear warm clothes. But Romeo did not listen to him and took only tea bags with him. Reporters were already working hard at the tower, waiting for the various guilds to appear. The journalists were most looking forward to the appearance of the Gaon Guild, as they were definitely expected to appear here. And just then a group of players appeared with Christoph standing at the head of the group, like a true leader. Hungry for an exclusive, reporters immediately surrounded the group of players and began bombarding them with hundreds of questions, shouting over each other. Christoph did not deprive them of this joy, and with his words began to add fuel to the fire, saying that he did not know how to defeat the Count. Jack tried to stop his brother, as such information could cause significant damage to the guild's reputation. But the team captain continued. He also stated that he did not intend to share the information with other teams. Suddenly, all the journalists' attention shifted as a new guild appeared on the horizon. The new guild was called the Shining Ones, and they were led by a guy named Samuel, who was level 399. Seeing his opponents, Samuel smiled as he sensed their excitement about the upcoming battle. Christoph watched closely the new team that had just arrived at the tower. Jack decided to encourage his brother and advised him not to worry and to do everything slowly and carefully. Christoph remembered that his brother was supposed to contact Romeo and asked how the negotiations were going. He was also interested in the question of whether he would go to the rift today, and maybe they would even be able to meet in the magic tower. At this time, Romeo was riding on a bus to his destination and at the same time watching videos about magic spells. He finally fully understood the process of activating magic, which consisted of exploring the power, interfering with it, and manifesting it. While thinking about the process of creating a spell, he inadvertently repeated what was in the video. The driver quickly reacted and asked not to perform any spells on the bus, as it could be dangerous. Romeo said he was in complete control of what was happening, but would certainly stop at the driver's request. Romeo then decided to check if any new skills had appeared in his characteristics, but they weren't there, although they usually appeared immediately. Soon he reached the tower and, standing in front of its entrance, he collected his thoughts to go inside, preparing for the upcoming trials. The protagonist was struck by the fact that the tower's exterior was very different from its interior structure. He approached the portal and felt something strange, as if he could understand portal magic. It seemed to him that this magic was even simpler than the fire magic he had used before. However, a man passing by suddenly carelessly touched him and pushed him into the portal. Romeo reprimanded his subordinate for his clumsiness and asked his brother to start the team briefing. Jack showed a diagram of the rift, which consisted of 3 circles. The outer circle meant the rift of the outskirts of the territories. The inner circle was the territory of the Count's family, and the last central circle was the fortress of the Count's family. In Concord, journalists and television crews gradually began to gather around the first fault. This fault also attracted bloggers who broadcast live about the incident. The blogger tried to push away and threaten the player who was approaching him, since he was the first to find this rift and did not want to lose his advantage. Romeo, with anger in his voice, asked the boy to leave while he still had patience. Having finally reached the rift, the guy began to study the information about it. The rift was suitable for levels 240-270, and the degree of its destruction was not great yet. However, he was not the only one who arrived at the rift. Inside, a battle was already in full swing with some red-haired girl. Her team followed closely behind her, barely keeping up with their lively leader. The red-haired girl's name was Ruby. She was the leader of the Berserk Guild, had level 348 and was in the top 100 players. It was even colder inside the rift than outside, but Romeo didn't care as his rage fueled him. Already at the entrance, 100 angry wolves of level 230 were waiting for him, ready to tear anyone to pieces. Even though Romeo's level was much lower, he activated the natural enemy skill, which would help him in battle. The protagonist took out his blade and promised to help the monsters feel the fear of becoming prey. Despite the enemy's numerical superiority, the Berserker gang continued to fight. Guildmaster Ruby fought against everyone's despair, mercilessly destroying one enemy after another. After a short rest, Ruby listened carefully, trying to catch any suspicious sounds that might indicate the presence of an enemy. The team was incredibly exhausted and tired after this tough battle. The team leader noticed that the monsters seemed not to feel fear or even to be aware of it. It all seemed somehow unnatural to her because none of the animals whined or howled in pain. The squad instantly became wary, listening carefully to her words. They knew that her intuition was sharp as a blade, and if she sensed danger, then it was so. Suddenly, from somewhere far away, a frightened howl was heard, echoing throughout the area. Ruby, without wasting a second, rushed toward the source of the noise to find out what was going on. Romeo tried to use his magical powers to enchant the arrow. At first, as in training, he explored the power, then interfered with it, and then manifested it by releasing a fire arrow. The arrow hit its target, instantly turning the enemies into a pile of ash. Arriving at the place where the noise was coming from, Ruby saw the burning corpses of monsters, and Romeo was sitting next to them. To finally warm up and regain his strength, the guy decided to take a break and make himself a cup of tea, especially since there was plenty of fire around. Ruby was shocked and irritated by the sight of this strange man, whose appearance did not even match the situation. One of the team members suggested that it could have been a lost blogger who had accidentally entered the rift. Ruby agreed with this assumption and rudely addressed the guy. She told him to get out of here since it was very dangerous for a civilian here. Romeo ignored her words and continued drinking tea. The girl, who had always been confident and strong, did not expect to face such neglect and disrespect from a stranger. Before she had time to express her indignation to the guy, she was suddenly interrupted by the team, informing her of approaching enemies. With each passing moment, the massive army of undead, numbering thousands of ruthless warriors, continued its deadly advance, drawing ever closer to the player team. Ruby, being an experienced and talented commander, quickly and clearly gave orders to all her warriors to take specific combat positions on the battlefield. The battle began, and each team member worked in unison, trying to kill as many monsters as possible. Ruby was the most experienced and courageous fighter on the team. Every strike of her sword was precise and deadly, leaving behind defeated enemies. However, in addition to the melee undead, there were also monster archers lying in ambush above, firing hundreds of sharp arrows at the team. Out of the corner of her eye, Ruby noticed that the stranger was still sitting with a cup of tea. But Romeo wasn't just sitting there. He was wondering if he would be able to perform a magic spell now. The leader of the archers gave a signal to his subordinates, and they immediately began firing at the team of heroes, releasing one deadly arrow after another. It seemed the end had come. Arrows whistled through the air and rushed towards the enemy at great speed. Romeo decided to try to explore the power inside the thermos, interfere with it, and manifest it. Since using such a skill requires a large amount of strength, which the protagonist could not handle, he would have passed out. But if this spell is not a skill, then everything can work out. He decided to take a risk and test this theory, even though it was dangerous. The thermos was converted into energy, and this energy began to separate into different parts. Ruby was ready to say goodbye to her life, but a minute later she was still alive. The thermos transformed into a huge stone wall, which reflected all the arrows and saved the lives of the team. The team captain was shocked by what happened. She had never seen anything like this before. She had only heard about the existence of alchemy. Romeo denied that it was an alchemy skill, saying that he used real magic. The team whispered to each other. They speculated about who this mysterious stranger could be and suggested that he could be an alchemist. From what happened, the hero gained the knowledge that he could change the shape of objects if he intervened with force, which was truly similar to alchemy. But there was no time to rest, as new monsters were already rushing towards them from the other side of the wall. The bloodthirsty undead, armed with blades, rapidly approached the guild members, intending to attack them. They were ruthless and determined to destroy their victims. Romeo said with sarcasm in his voice that they would have to postpone tea and start fighting. A group of players, armed with swords and shields, rushed into battle, their faces full of determination and courage, and their eyes burning with the fire of battle. Ruby, who also ran towards the enemies, ordered the protagonist to stay behind the team for his safety. However, Romeo had a different plan. He took out an enchanted arrow and bow from behind his back. On the battlefield, one of the fighters was wounded and needed a healer, and a monster was rushing from behind toward the unsuspecting guy holding the wounded man. The protagonist reacted instantly and sent an arrow straight into the enemy's chest. The rescued man was amazed by the skill and courage of the hunter who saved him. Without wasting any time, the protagonist pulled back the string of his bow and prepared to release the next arrow. Ruby was shocked that the arrow shot by the archer was on fire, which meant that the stranger was an alchemist, an archer, and a magician. Finally, all the enemies were killed, and now the players, tired after a tough battle, could take a rest. The captain praised her team for their good work and began to watch the hunter. Romeo irritated her because he did not answer her questions properly, and she was also annoyed by his inappropriate clothes. She felt awkward admitting that if it weren't for his help, they could have died. So she thought about thanking him for his help. As if sensing the girl's gaze, the guy turned and began to watch her. Ruby, flushed with embarrassment, quickly turned around and carefully tried to hide her emotions from him. Romeo continued to look at the girl, who did not understand why he was staring at her for so long. She suggested that maybe he wanted to invite her for tea. Then the guy came up to her and said in a blank voice that she could stare at him as much as she wanted, but he didn't have any extra tea for her. Ruby was stunned by these words and wanted to disappear into the ground. On the other side of the rift, a journalist was reporting live from the scene. He said that this rift was one of 3 that appeared in this update. To reach the next level, you need to clear all the first-level rifts, which is what other guilds are doing right now. The director of one of the channels was extremely worried about who would be the first to clear the rift so that he could interview them before anyone else. One of the workers came into his tent, offered him tea, and told him the news that was currently known. All the teams were somewhere in the middle, but the Shining Guild was the fastest. The director's assistant rushed past the reporter standing in front of the cameras, hurrying to carry out an important assignment. He shouted that one of the rifts had been cleared, but he didn't know by whom and that they needed to run to it quickly. The director yelled into the phone at his assistant to finally tell him what he saw and what kind of guild it was. The assistant said it was the Berserker Guild led by Ruby. The director couldn't believe it. Berserk wasn't the strongest guild, it was in 32nd place. The assistant also noticed a Korean among those who came out of the rift, which was strange, since Berserk was a European guild. The news of the first guild clearing the rift spread quickly, and a crowd of reporters was already running to the site of their exit. The assistant did not hesitate and tried to interview Romeo. He asked about what happened inside the rift and about his connection with Berserker. However, Romeo was not eager to answer the man's questions and demanded that he step away. Reporters, who arrived at the scene at the speed of light, immediately surrounded the guild and began asking questions. Ruby did not want to talk about what happened, as she did not feel she had fully contributed to it and declined to comment. She wanted that mysterious stranger to answer all her questions, but she was informed that he had already left. Ruby was furious, as such an interview could completely change the player's status, since it is an honor to clear the rift first. A little later, another rift turned blue and a new guild emerged from it, clearing the rift. It was the Gaon Guild with its leader Christoph. The team was immediately surrounded and asked to give a short comment on their second place. Once at their camp, the first thing Jack and his brother did was turn on the news to find out the latest news about the rifts. Ruby's words as she left deeply hurt Christoph because they were so rude. Jack was surprised. Because these were the only words in the interview after the first cleanup of this team, he still did not understand how they could overtake them. Christoph was furious because now Gaon was not the only strong guild in the country. Jack assumed that they had met someone stronger in the rift, and the only person that came to mind was his recent acquaintance. Upon arriving home, the first thing Romeo did was take a shower to warm up and wash off the blood of his slain enemies. After the shower, James hoped that Romeo would go to bed, but he had other plans, more cleaning. After Romeo returned from the shower, he cooked dinner and cleared away the dishes. At this point, James had time to check the stat update. It turned out that his level had only increased by 19 points, even though the mission had been extremely dangerous. James analyzed that magic required less power than skills, but it took much longer to replenish. Equipment could alleviate the situation, but Romeo only had a suit as equipment. James realized that the strange girl had given him all the assistance she could in the battle and that he should thank her. Romeo said that it was all because of his weakness, as he could not accept the fact that someone underestimated him and wanted to prove them otherwise. He stated that the next target would be the Count's territory, and to do this, he would need to acquire new skills. He found a suitable subject for research, that red-haired girl, but he decided to start with new daily tasks. While heading out to check, the guy was simultaneously listening to the news on the radio. Breaking news reports stated that 95% of the outskirts of the area had been cleared, but according to information received, the process of fault destruction had suddenly jumped to 60%. At this rate, the fault could break through. The Gaon Guild, who was watching the same news, was very concerned about this information, because only a day had passed, and such a sharp jump had never happened before. Jack said that the time to clear is reduced if there are strong monsters in the rift. The channel's director demanded that the cause of such a jump be found, since judging by previous data, the rupture of the fault was proceeding more slowly. The workers said that even the guilds did not know the reason for the rapid damage to the rift. The company's success was no longer a concern here. If the rift opened and the monsters escaped, all players and civilians would die. The protagonist had to hurry, because only he knew why this was happening, since information about it was stored only in Akshan. Vampires are creatures that share power through blood. Count Ascura divided his power between monsters, and after the monsters died, his power returned to him. He began to pour the returned power into the monsters of the Count's family's territory, so it became stronger, and the process of destruction accelerated. James realized that if a raid began on the Count's territory, there was a chance that the rift would collapse immediately. Romeo believed that Ascura was unworthy of bearing the title of Count, and promised to become the monster's judge and punish him. The young man was broadcasting live right next to the new rift, the destruction level of which was already 70%. Although at this moment it was early morning and many guilds were already gathering at the scene. The blogger told his viewers that, unlike the outskirts of the territories where there were more than 200 rifts, the Count's family's territory had only 30 entrances, and from this it followed that several guilds would lay claim to one rift. While the guy was talking about a possible battle between two strong guilds, Jack from the Gaon Guild walked behind him. Christoph immediately asked his brother if he had learned anything useful. Jack stated that competition would be inevitable because there were too few faults. When asked if they would have to meet the Shining Guild, he would reply that he saw them pass further north. A streamer hiding to observe the team heard about the battle between Guilds 1 and 2. But then, unexpectedly, people from another well-known guild approached Goen from behind. Christoph was furious because he found out what kind of guild was approaching them and was full of rage. The group that had the captain so worried was the Inazuma Guild, led by Trent, who was level 376. The Inazuma clan and the Gaon clan were two powerful guilds that had been feuding for a long time. Both captains were reluctant to enter the same rift, but they had no choice. Reporters immediately flocked to the news of the competition between the two strongest guilds. Reporters, journalists, and bloggers bombarded members of both teams with a barrage of questions. Jack tried to calm his brother down by reminding him that the main problem was the destruction of the rift, and if the clans competed, everyone would lose. Suddenly, someone from the crowd shouted that Gaon were losers who were weaker than Inazuma. These words ignited a new fire of hatred among the Gaon members, and they promised to tear their rivals to pieces and become the first. In the news reports, the journalist reported that the Northern Rift was divided between the Shining and Heaven United guilds, while the Berserk, Second Sun, and Bohemian teams were sent into the Southern Rift, and the rift's severity had increased to 80%. Romeo was already inside the rift on the territory of the Count's family. He thought about how to use the power of magic more effectively. Alchemists' magic allows them to shape objects into any shape, so the boy was able to create a cup and a table out of stone. However, the protagonist noticed that the more detailed the object he creates, the more effort it takes, so this skill is not very useful in battle. Romeo was being attacked by an army of enemies, but this was just what he needed, as it gave him the opportunity to test out another way to use magic. He concentrated on the new spell and was ready to cast it. The monsters sensed something strange and paused a little, their eyes wide with fear. The hunter turned the monsters into stone by using the ability to return them to their original state. The expenditure of power for this spell was minimal, and he decided to call it reverse magic. Somewhere in the depths of the Count's territory, the Gaon Guild was fighting monsters. The guild leader fought more fiercely than anyone else, inflicting damage on his opponents with his huge sword with a bestial fury. Huge, ferocious monsters rushed at him, trying to tear him to pieces. Kristoff was a seasoned warrior, his swordsmanship unmatched as he repelled attack after attack. Having finished with all the opponents, he noticed that there were suspiciously few enemies. Along the way, they encountered no more than 10 attackers. A witch from his clan reported that after inspecting the area and conducting reconnaissance, Inazuma had the same situation. Although the groups had initially gone their separate ways, Gaon was met by her rivals, who had followed the witch as she returned from reconnaissance. Trent also noted that the atmosphere was suspiciously calm. The team captains once again engaged in a verbal altercation, promising to kill each other. Their argument was interrupted by Jack, who was monitoring the team through drones. He wanted to know the team's location, as he was having problems with the signal. Upon learning that the team was in the town square, he immediately told them to get out of there. But unfortunately, there was no time left to escape, as the enemies were approaching and a fight was inevitable. An army of Count Oscura's knights, level 350, was rushing towards them. Kristoff did not expect that they would face such a powerful army, but they could not give up and had to continue fighting. The captain remembered that the destructive power of cavalry doubles on the plain. He did not know what to do because even tanks would be damaged if they were placed in the vanguard. In this difficult situation, Trent offered to cooperate with Kristoff, although he did not like the idea. The enemies began to attack from the other side, causing the group of players to be surrounded. Jack reported that one union had already fought this cavalry and suffered huge losses, so it was necessary to retreat immediately. But there was nowhere to retreat, since the enemies had already come too close. As soon as Kristoff swung at one of the riders, everything around was filled with a bluish light, and right in front of them, stone pillars were erected, blocking the entrance to the horsemen. The players were confused. They didn't know who their savior was. This savior, as might be expected, was Romeo, a famous hero and a strong player. At this time, a blogger went to the location of the Gaon guilds to spy on them. But viewers warned that Gaon was already being followed by a large number of bloggers, and therefore he should go and follow Inazuma. The players couldn't figure out how this mysterious man created stone pillars all over the field. With just one gesture, without a single sound, he raised pillars all over the battlefield. It was an extremely powerful and little-known magic. Trent wondered what kind of power this player could possess, and what made it even stranger was the fact that he wasn't wearing any combat gear. But the time for these reflections was suddenly interrupted by the team's cries about new enemies. The enemies broke through again and ran towards them through the stone pillars, knocking them to the ground. Kristoff noticed that the stone pillars reduced the cavalry's mobility, for which he later intended to thank Romeo. The commander had a barbarian class skill activated, which significantly increased his combat power and made him invulnerable to damage. Finally, now he could be on par with his opponents and inflict good damage on them. With his huge, sharp sword, Kristoff struck down several horsemen at once. Trent's army also decided to join the fight, and on the captain's orders, they were to grind any monster into dust. The blogger who came to Inazuma was shocked and broadcast everything that happened online. Romeo entered the battle and fought alone against a knight who was much stronger than him. He used anti-magic to turn his opponent into stone and single-handedly defeated the cavalry knight. Then he approached the remaining enemy with a dagger in his hands and wanted to kill him, but the weapon had low durability. Romeo decided to try to interact with the power of the dagger to change its shape and then restore it to its original state. But he did not know whether the original strength would be restored. Still, he took a risk and transformed the dagger into a silver awl, which was much stronger, but could only deal one blow. To the protagonist's surprise, the dagger returned to its original state and did not lose its durability. Jack told his brother in an earpiece that this was the very same hunter. Seeing him in person made Christophe want him in his guild even more. Inazuma also wanted to acquire such a valuable player and offered him exorbitant terms, but Romeo seemed to ignore it. Then a young blogger approached him with a request to give him an interview. After the battle, members of Team Inazuma ran up to Romeo and started asking him if he was a member of any guild and would like to join them. Christophe, pushing aside the opposing team, also made an offer to join his guild. In a live broadcast watched by over 70,000 people, the protagonist refused the leader of Goen and demanded that he get out of the way. At the Shining One's temporary camp, the leader and his team watched the recent news about Romeo's refusal. Samuel, the head of the guild, was interested in this young man and wanted to know more about him. A girl named Rosalia said that it was unclear which class he was exactly from. The news kept replaying the live broadcast footage of the mysterious player over and over again. Rosalia had no doubt that her boss could easily get his hands on this hunter. Carl was furious that everyone was talking about some guy and not their first purge of all the groups. Samuel said it's not unusual for the media to go crazy when a newcomer appears, as their ratings depend on the exclusive. The witch Jessie crept up behind the leader. She was impressed by this guy's magic, since she had never seen anything like it before. This man aroused her strong curiosity, and she discovered many intriguing and attractive qualities in him. Guildmaster Inazuma also wanted to recruit a silver-haired man into his team. In the news reports, the reporter said that the Count's family's territory had been successfully cleared, and the first team this time was the Shining Guild. At the moment, only the Count's Fortress Rift remains, and at the moment, the progress of the rift is 72%, and players from all over the world are preparing to enter it. Given the high stakes, tension is at an all-time high in the players' temporary camps, as the rift could burst at any moment. Then the channel started showing videos from the battle site in which Romeo was present. The news anchors discussed how this mysterious player did not have a single magical accessory, which would have been necessary under such circumstances. They even suggested that the lack of accessories might have been some kind of strategy, but Romeo simply didn't have them. The presenter asked the expert whether it was possible to move objects with one-hand movement, to which he spoke about the boy's decisive and clever decision to change the terrain, since the enemy's mobility was his vulnerability. James began to check the items he received for clearing the rift. It turned out that he had received a rare item, a necklace imbued with a blood curse with a sealed effect. This was the name given to cursed demonic items that could be cursed, and then, with a certain probability, random effects would appear. This item can also be used as a sacrifice during an exorcism rite. Although the main goal of the ritual was to kill the demon without harming the person, with the sacrifice everything will be different. The guy would be able to invite the demon into his mind and fight him there with an advantage. But the risks were also high. Suddenly Romeo's phone rang, and it turned out that it was Jack from the Goen Guild calling him. The guy didn't want to pick up the phone, as he guessed that he wouldn't hear anything good, only reproaches for his words. Romeo only sent a message in which he wrote only one word: problematic. Christophe was upset because he wanted to apologize for being impolite earlier and offer better conditions. In any case, there was nothing they could do since he wasn't answering his calls, and Count Ascura was more important at the moment. There was information on the internet that the fault had already reached 84%, but suddenly an earthquake began. It turned out that the Count's family's fortress suddenly broke into the real world for an unknown reason. Concord authorities have advised all civilians to evacuate immediately, as the death toll has already exceeded 200. The Count's fortress was huge and terrifying, rising up from the ground. Romeo had already arrived at the scene. He didn't expect that she would break through. He walked confidently towards the front entrance of the estate and, as usual, he was alone. At the very threshold of the estate stood a huge stone sculpture in the form of a winged mythical creature. Romeo felt nothing but discomfort at this monument, and the fortress itself seemed too lousy even for a vampire. But suddenly the statue began to move, its stone wings began to spread, and its eyes began to flash with red flames. The players standing behind were shocked by this. They didn't know what to do, help the guy, or run away. The monster was ready to attack Romeo, who stood in front of him. He even swung a huge saber. However, with just one wave of his hand, the guy turned the monster into a pile of stones. The Shining Guild had already arrived at the scene, and they heard a deafening sound just like the one from the video on the news today. Jessie decided to go and see for herself who was making such a noise. Romeo was irritated. The statue disgusted him, and the fact that the Count was proud of these statues seemed pathetic to him. After killing the gatekeeper, the players immediately rushed inside the fortress, pushing each other. The protagonist noticed an update to his quests. A new task with a strange name appeared in them. Let them be afraid that the hunt has begun. James suggested that Romeo first think about what the new task meant, but they didn't have time to solve riddles. After this, the main character quickly entered the huge, gloomy banquet hall. On the walls of the fortress hung paintings of the Count, which were disgustingly poorly painted. Finally, the Gaon Guild in full force was one of the last to arrive at the Count's fortress. Ever since Christophe walked into the corridor with the paintings, he had the feeling that someone was looking at him. Jack realized that this place had an anomalous status imposed by demons. All this was because of the portraits, and they needed to be burned. After the portraits were destroyed, Christophe felt much better. Jack warned that most of the players had already retreated due to the traps that were in the castle, the interiors of the castle causing status anomalies. Christophe realized that it didn't matter how strong his barbarian class was, since he was so easily affected by the abnormal status. Romeo made sarcastic comments about the interior of the fortress, believing that the Count was narcissistic. And finally, he reached the right place, through the tangled corridors of the castle. At the top of the stairs were huge carved doors from which a foul odor emanated. The protagonist knew that Count Oscura was somewhere nearby, and the silence around him suggested that the other players had not yet arrived. Suddenly, as if out of nowhere, the head of a fair-haired sorceress appeared right in front of him from above. She expressed great admiration for the boy's unusual magic and began asking him about his skills. Romeo, outraged by the girl's behavior, asked her to observe etiquette, since these are the basics that a person should possess. Suddenly, the door above swung open and the dark silhouette of the Count appeared before them. Romeo's natural enemy skill was activated and he was ready to fight. The Count, who was known for his hot temper, asked who dared to disturb his peace. Romeo was not ready to hide his anger and disgust towards the monster. He told him that he was not worthy of bearing the title of Count. The brave player's words amused Oscura. She didn't expect such courage and confidence from the man. Romeo took out from his jacket the necklace that had been chosen as a sacrifice for the ritual. The guy said that he would teach the Count a lesson, and then a new skill, the exorcism ritual, was activated in him. Romeo was about to summon Oscura into his mind and fight there, but the vampire only smirked when he saw the dirty necklace. To become stronger, the Count began to collect power, which he shared with his followers. However, this did not help. The necklace absorbed the vampire's consciousness, transporting him to an unknown place. Oscura was confused. Everything happened so quickly that even he couldn't understand where and how he got there. However, upon seeing his enemy, he did not begin to talk, but immediately went on the attack. He sent a stream of fire towards the protagonist to destroy him, and was a little upset that the battle ended so quickly. However, the guy did not turn to ashes. He was still alive and threw a caustic jab at the Count. The Count was furious at the boy's insolence. He couldn't understand how he could have survived, and without a single scratch. Romeo told the Count to take a closer look at which of them was alive and which was dead. Then the Count saw an illusion of his corpse, on which a hunter was sitting. Romeo came out of his consciousness and released the Count from it, after which he fell down screaming and unconscious. The Count woke up from the words of the hunter, who mocked and intimidated him. The vampire was in complete rage due to his powerlessness. He tried to gather all his strength and strike at the enemy. But he didn't succeed. He missed and only blew off the roof of the building, and at that moment, Romeo's exorcism skill kicked in. The monster did not understand what was about to happen to him. This man made him doubt his power. The one with the highest spiritual strength takes the initiative in the ritual. So due to the Count's impotence, this person turned out to be the protagonist. The demon didn't have a single chance to shake Romeo's mind. He begged him not to come closer. The witch was amazed by this incredible sight and asked the guy what was happening to the Count now. The Count was in a state of insanity due to fear, he screamed, looking into space, attacked where there was no one and tried to escape from this horror. A fear similar to the state that demons instill in people gripped the vampire Count Oscura and then completely overwhelmed him. The new task was completed. All that remained was to finish off the Count. The guy raised his dagger over the vampire. Then he struck, but the damage was too small. Then he realized that he needed help. Romeo asked the girl to finish the murder, and she began to ask him why he couldn't do it himself. The witch realized that there was no time for questions now. First, it was necessary to kill the monster. She apologized for her tactlessness and prepared to cast a powerful spell. Finally, she struck the monster, which with just one blow turned into a pile of ash. The Count was finally defeated, but the boy was still amazed by the witch's enormous power. The Shining One's team was already running towards them from behind, reporting that all anomaly statuses had been removed, and they realized that the enemy had been defeated. The team began to question their member about whether she was the one who killed Count Oscura. Jessie finally introduced herself to the protagonist and asked his name, and also promised to learn etiquette. Although the girl lacked etiquette, as a reward for her help, Romeo decided to become her teacher, and then he said his name. On the other side of the planet, a girl was watching the news, which reported on a guy who went alone to the Count's fortress. The girl recognized this man. She ran up to her mother and began to pull her towards the TV to show her this guy. This girl's uncle, that is, her mother's brother, was shown on TV. Returning home, Romeo, as usual, began his routine ritual of cleaning. All this time, he was constantly receiving calls from his sisters, which was not so surprising after dozens or even hundreds of reports about him on television. James had 3 sisters, all of whom were friends with each other, but the boy didn't want to pick up the phone because he knew his sisters would yell at him. Suddenly, there was a deafening knock on the door and the sisters' screams, demanding that the door be opened and let in. The main character opened the door, and 3 sisters appeared in front of him. The eldest Lily with her daughter, the middle Olivia, and the youngest Alice. The guy asked the sisters to calm down, not to make noise and not to disturb the neighbors, and invited them into the house. The news continued to talk about Romeo and his victory over Count Oscura, along with the player Jessie. This guy became the hottest topic in the news. Jack, watching this news, wondered whether Romeo would still come to their guild after a huge number of invitations from other groups. Christoph was sure that the guy would join them. At least they had a phone number and a reason to contact him. Jack had completely forgotten about the prize from the battle in the dungeon, and the right decision was to give part of the reward to Romeo and negotiate with him. The Goanna captain was inspired, because even if they couldn't take the hunter for themselves, they would at least show him respect and gratitude for his help. Each sister reacted differently to the main character's new look. One made fun of him, another said she liked her brother's new look, and the third was distrustful. His younger sister asked him if he really became a player, and that's why his appearance changed because of the character. The sisters began to remember that their brother had behaved this way before in childhood, when he had invented a second personality. Finally, one of the sisters spoke about why they had come. The girls were concerned about the danger the game posed. The sisters were extremely surprised to see their brother on the news. They were afraid that their brother might be wounded in battle or even die. They also said that they would support him in any case and would always be on his side. The main character was touched by these words. At parting, the brother thanked his sisters for their kind words, and they told him not to waste his money in vain. It dawned on James that he should have been paid money for winning such a major battle. The guy couldn't believe his eyes. There were more than 100 billion won in his bank account. At this time, in the Tower of the Shining Ones, Rosalia was interrogating Jessie with questions about Romeo. She wanted to know what kind of person he was. Jessie turned to the girl, looked at her with an icy gaze, and asked her to stop bothering her. Rosalia gave in and said she wouldn't ask any more, but she was tormented by the question of why the sorceress was watching a video about etiquette. After the battle with the Count, Romeo automatically received the Count's vampire orb for winning the duel. It was a cursed item with a unique rating of 400. Also, the necklace that the boy used as a sacrifice also remained with him, and the curse was lifted from it. James couldn't sleep. All his thoughts were occupied with the money he received in his account. He was deciding what to do with it. Perhaps it would have been worth putting them into deposits, or better to buy magical items. However, there were very few items of the appropriate level, and it turned out that purchasing an item was a waste of money. At the development headquarters, they studied fragments of the video showing the magic performed by Romeo. The workers argued with each other. Some claimed that it was alchemy, while others refuted this theory. The formula for the alchemy limit said that such a thing could not be created, one man argued, to which the other replied that it looked like alchemy. One of the employees started looking for Romeo in the player database, but there was no one with that name in the database. The developer suggested that attention to this player would subside after the release of the new update. Since it was Thursday that day, it happened that the company received an email notifying them of the update. The letter stated that the update would introduce a new region, Yusra Island, a mysterious area that was once referred to as a treasure island in the original game. The news reported that the Mage Conference will be held again this week. Romeo listened with interest about the first regular academic conference since Arcana appeared in real life. The news reported that one of the invited witches, Jessie, had arrived at the tower. The protagonist understood where this witch got such great power from, since she was the fourth-ranked player in the world, and he was also going to attend this conference. James was a little scared, but he still understood that there was a high chance of getting some benefit from going there. The Tower of Magicians was noisy and crowded, with a motley crowd arriving from all corners of the earth. An experienced witch, Cassie was pleased and excited to resume the regular conference. No one present noticed Cassie. Since she was behind an invisible barrier, she called out the guy who collided with the barrier near her. Then a woman came through the portal, who turned out to be the famous witch Jessie, and she shamed the gatekeeper for her rudeness. Jessie reminded him that no one could see this magic without an invitation, so it wasn't the boy's fault. Cassie apologized and took the invitation from the witch's outstretched hand. She then stated that Jessie was the last guest on the guest list, so she was about to leave. The guest asked the girl to stay late, as she guessed that another person would come to the conference. Romeo arrived at the Tower of the Magicians and was amazed by its beauty and grandeur inside. But every time he came there was a huge crowd of people, through which it was difficult to squeeze through. Suddenly, someone in the crowd noticed him and started making a fuss about the mysterious hunter from the news being there. One of the fans asked to take a photo with his idol. Romeo, in a state of great irritation, expressed his disapproval very sharply, refusing his request. The fan was not at all embarrassed by this answer. He was happy that his idol sent him to live. After this, other people from the crowd began to ask Romeo to scold them. The guy noticed something strange in the wall to his left. It was somehow different from the others, and felt different somehow. The guy ran through the wall, finding himself in a secret place where a closed event was taking place. Cassie then went to accompany the man to the conference venue. The girl frantically went through the guest lists, looking for someone she might have missed. But according to the list, all the guests had already arrived. Romeo politely asked the girl if she had any questions or problems with the list. The flushed girl objected that everything was fine and asked the guest again whether he had come to the conference and why he didn't have an invitation. The sorceress did not understand how the guy, without an invitation, was able to see the illusion and end up here. The guy asked if he could take part in the conference without a prior invitation. Cassie assured him that this was possible, since there was a rule that anyone who could see through the illusion could come to the conference even without an invitation. The guy turned out to be the first person who saw the illusion without an invitation. Finally, they reached the desired Crystal Hall, the place of search for sublime knowledge. When Arcana became reality, the Arcana characters who lived inside the game also appeared in reality. And the man who was the most influential of them all was the successor of the Magic Tower. Now he was the most important magician named Marcel. Jessie was so bored listening to the story that she even fell asleep because she came here for the quest. Marcel said that the Magic Tower was summoned to the world of travelers for some unknown reason, and since this happened, travelers and NPCs need to work as a team. Jessie became interested and awakened when she heard that the chief magician would talk about science and magic. Marcel invented a new kind of fire that was created through magic and science and was called fusion. He continued to talk about how one must be extremely careful with this magic, since the variables still remain unknown. Marcel said he needed help researching these concepts and asked if anyone had any questions. A hand went up from the back of the audience, and a man was eager to ask a question. Romeo noted that there was some disorder in the chief magician's research. Marcel was confused, so he asked the guy to explain why he thought so. The guy began his explanation by saying that he simply felt the difference in the process of merging between magic and science. He demonstrated exactly the same spell because he had experienced the same difference before, but between skill and magic. Marcel was surprised and couldn't believe that the guy was able to easily repeat a spell that he saw for the first time. Romeo continued to talk about using centrifugal force in the intervention process. Even though the spell wasn't finished, it was still pretty good. Marcel asked this unusually insightful young man to join him in his research. Because of this offer, the guy got a new quest, and he was glad that he had not come here in vain. At this time, the Berserker Guild arrived on a new, unexplored island, full of secrets and mysteries. The island was already teeming with reporters, journalists, and curious bloggers eager to learn more about the new location. Also, to the surprise of many non-player characters, the Arcanians arrived on the island. This was because the island was known as a treasure island. Ruby was unhappy with this, as she assumed that the Arcanians would only get in the way. The captain received a call from a magician he knew, who informed him that the conference had already ended and that Romeo had attended it. The girl was amused by the fact that the guy, as usual, behaved like a madman and began to lecture the chief magician. The girl was surprised that the hunter wasn't kicked out, but the fact that the chief mage admitted his mistake and offered the guy a quest finally finished her off. Marcel said that if the main character needed any items, he would gladly bring them regardless of the cost. Romeo took him at his word and was delighted with this wonderful opportunity. At the very top of the magic tower, the 5-star noblest magicians called Marcel for a conversation. The magician said that he had heard about conducting a joint study with the traveler. He reminded Marcel that the main rule of the magic tower was not to interfere in the affairs of travelers and demanded an explanation from him. The wizard began to explain that the traveler had definitely understood the concept of magic and overcome its gap, and that this man also had great magical talent. The chief magician said that magicians judge themselves and must take responsibility for themselves and their actions. Although the head of the Magic Council had no intention of punishing the boy, he ordered him to be responsible for his choice. Marcel didn't like these wizards because they were hypocritical, talking about responsibility but never taking it themselves. At the council doors, he ran into Cassie, who was carrying huge boxes of various magical items. He asked her what she was doing on the top floor, to which the girl replied that she had in her hands the things that Romeo had requested. Marcel offered his help to the girl as he himself was heading towards the guy. The wizard brought all the necessary magical tools and books that the boy asked for. Romeo was shocked by such rare and powerful artifacts, but their level was very high. Marcel asked the guy if he liked the things and if he liked them. Without hiding his slight irritation, the hunter said that the items he had brought were useless because they were not up to his level. Marcel apologized for his inattention and said that he had underestimated the guy. He also didn't know about the existence of items related to regeneration, but it turned out that they really do exist. The mage handed the boy a 6-star brooch, which did not have the required level, and it also restored 10% of strength. After Romeo noticed the gap in magic, the wizard considered him an unusual magician, but it turned out he was so brilliant that he even knew about the existence of such an artifact. At first, the main character was distrustful of this brooch, as he did not understand the usefulness of its magical properties. With disappointment in his voice, Marcel said that they would not be able to continue the research at the moment. Romeo understood everything and said that he would wait until the magician had overcome the gap, and he would keep the brooch for now. Marcel thanked the player for his understanding, and then he realized that it was no coincidence that he had met Romeo, because with him he could change the magic tower. A blogger who captured the most famous footage from the previous rift has already arrived on the island. A huge number of players gathered in front of the portal to the island, waiting to be sent. Suddenly, from somewhere behind, a menacing-looking player, unfamiliar to him, attacked the boy. It was Kinber from the infamous Supernova Guild, as accidents always happened around them. Kinber asked to convey a message to Romeo that sounded more like a threat. The boy was extremely scared and angry, and people were even writing nasty things about his idol in the chat of his broadcast. After studying books for a long time, the main character took a short break and wondered whether he should go to the island. James thought that there was nothing to do on the island, since there were no demons there, and the regular mobs there were too strong. However, the plans had to change, because the guy received a notification about a new assignment. The mission was to investigate the great evil on Yusra Island, which meant defeating the 7 deadly sins on the island. James thought that he had defeated the Count by chance and that such a miracle would not happen twice. But Romeo didn't care much about this. Before, he had no reason to go. But now he had doubts, which meant there was no reason to hesitate. The blogger, who had been so eagerly awaiting the meeting with his idol, was simply happy. Romeo, who had sailed to the island, was determined to figure out what was going on there. But as soon as the main character found himself on the island, he felt something was wrong. He felt a strong influence on the entire island, and his hunting skill also activated. The guy suggested that such a strong influence could be caused by another level of demons. The hunter felt a huge sense of evil beneath his feet. Perhaps the island itself was evil. Thus, his hunting skill would be active all the time. The blogger, hiding in the thicket of grass, watched Romeo from a distance so as not to disturb him. A fan suggested that the hunter had some kind of strategy for Yusra Island. The protagonist was looking for someone he could fight most effectively. He didn't want to start with less powerful monsters. The blogger informed the audience that he did not intend to interfere with Romeo, so he would stop broadcasting if necessary. Suddenly, sounds of fighting and rustling leaves were heard from the thickets. Someone or something was moving in the bushes, and this did not bode well. A couple of players came straight towards them, separated from their team and clearly in need of help. Because they were closely followed by an emerald tiger, which was impossible to aim at because of its transparent body, which reflected the sun's rays. The emerald tiger was the strongest monster on the island, with a level of 420. The players defending themselves from the monster finally looked around to see who they were facing. The reliable plan for a gradual and effective battle was unfortunately destroyed. Romeo began to calculate a plan of action. Since the sun was bright and the tiger's sparkling body obscured his view, it was necessary to immobilize the monster. The tiger rushed into attack with lightning speed, opening its huge mouth with sharp fangs. However, the hunter managed to react and had already created a fire spell, which he had recently studied in the magic tower. The tiger was engulfed in a stream of fire. A flash of light appeared, and then a powerful explosion occurred. The tiger was destroyed, and the guy received a reward for the victory and his level increased. The players standing nearby were shocked by what happened. How one person could destroy such a powerful monster with one blow. At this time, in another part of the island, the captain of the Second Sun Guild, Carl, was outraged since they could not go deep into the island. One of the team members offered to join the detachment that had separated. Carl wondered if it had been a mistake for the team to split up. He had planned to get as many achievements as possible on this outing. Perhaps it was all about the island and its influence, which the captain underestimated. A call came from the squad that had gone west. The guy said that they were going to return to the team since the route was clear. The captain didn't understand how the route could have been clear. Who could have cleared it? On the other line, there was a call regarding a report from a guild member who attended the magic conference Romeo attended. The guild leader ordered the analysis department to study everything about Romeo, as he may be more dangerous than is known. After the battle with the tiger, the main character received a pure emerald crystal with a unique rating for defeating it. Suddenly, Romeo felt as if the air had become colder and heavier. The guy received a new message from the game system notifying him of a new building. The earth began to shake and everything around was filled with a bloody light, and a warning appeared that the island of Yusra was beginning to be covered in greed. The players were in a panic. They realized that this would all mark the appearance of a new rift, although the creation mechanism was slightly different. Romeo was sure that the demon of greed was awakened by the greedy desires of the people who arrived on the island. From the notification window, one could conclude that the main character would have to fight the demon of greed. The blogger was also under stress and did not understand whether it was true that the process of rupture had now begun, because if this continued, then a great evil would awaken. Romeo received a new notification that said to stop the demon. This made the protagonist happy, as it made his task easier. It was necessary to hurry, as the thirst for profit had already clouded the players' minds. Romeo was not surprised by this reaction, as he knew that it was the influence of a demonic force. To ensure that the island's treasures were not tainted by greed, it was necessary for all players to renounce their desire for them. But this was problematic, as people's minds were already clouded. Romeo decided that there was only one option left, to collect all the treasures himself. The Shining Guild was already on the second island, and they managed to find the second treasure. Rosalia explained that the 10 islands are 10 levels of rupture, and as soon as one treasure is taken, a rupture occurs. Samuel suddenly asked his team if he could win a fight with Romeo. Rosalia was stunned and asked if he was joking, because if it wasn't a joke, then he would lose the best sorceress, Jessie. The team reported that the rupture process has risen to another level due to the World Unification Guild. The captain ordered everyone to get ready, since he also believed it was necessary to collect all the treasures. James tried to dissuade Romeo from his plan, but he was adamant. On the main character's path, an army appeared, with a flag and armor emblazoned with a lion. The hunter recognized this army of the Knights of the Lionheart and their commander, Richard Kingsler. One of the knights was furious that the boy had addressed their leader without respect. But Richard stopped his member and asked the traveler's name. Richard said he felt a completely different vibe from Romeo than from other travelers. Suddenly, a huge burning meteorite flew towards the army. This projectile was sent by the monster that was the owner of the island. Its level was 450. The Lionheart chief, standing at the head of his army, gave the order to all warriors to be ready for the upcoming battle. The turtle also went on the attack. A fiery meteorite could fly out of its eyes at any moment. Suddenly, a huge paw swept over the head of one of the army soldiers, almost crushing him. But the main character rushed to the rescue and, with the help of magic, erected a stone dome. There was no time for conversation, as the turtle went on the attack again, bombarding the guild with a hail of meteorites. The brooch was of great help to the main character in this situation, because without its energy, the guy would have already lost consciousness. The guild captain approached the boy, expressed his sincere gratitude, and offered his help at any time. The blogger broadcast everything that was happening online and was shocked that the guild leader swore an oath on his heart. The blogger came a little closer to take a close-up photo of the island's owner, who was looking fierce. Richard ordered his army of knights to attack the monster in the name of honor and justice. The main character stood on the field and suggested where it was best to hit the monster, whose weak points were the head and crown. First, it was necessary to tip the turtle over. Then its top would become visible, and then it was worth hitting it on the legs. However, the order performed much worse in battle than expected, although the guild itself was far from weak. The army was used to fighting at close range. Now the reserve troops simply stood behind and waited their turn to attack. Looking at the statistics of the destruction process, the main character was horrified, since the destruction was already 50%. Suddenly, the ground beneath the fighters' feet cracked and lava began to spill out of the cracks. The fighters had no room left to attack, so Romeo, showing ingenuity, decided to conjure up space for battle. He then asked the commander-in-chief of the troops whether he was ready to attack on the signal. Romeo was about to open the way for the fighters. He concentrated and put his power into action. Using almost all his power, the boy created a master ladder like in a magic tower. The Knights of the Lionheart were amazed by the protagonist's creative abilities. Meanwhile, their captain did not waste time and rushed to attack the owner of the island. Richard's army followed suit, and they simultaneously defeated the giant turtle. But the greatest damage was inflicted by the Lionheart's commander, who ended the battle with his blow. Romeo receives a game notification that Richard has refused the reward for this battle, and the other knights follow his example. Notifications came one after another, informing that the main character had increased his level and received trophies. Richard approaches Romeo and begins a conversation about the protagonist's brooch, which the Emperor gave to the Tower of Magicians in the distant past. The Lionheart's commander swears allegiance to the protagonist, promising to become his shield and sword. This unexpected statement surprises Romeo. He did not expect to gain such a powerful ally. The island's treasure appears before the main character, which is a reward for defeating the giant turtle. James is shocked by what he sees, and is unsure whether to accept the gift as it could be dangerous. Here the guy notices that someone has cleared out another island, as the destruction process has already reached 60%. While James was distracted by the news, Romeo managed to pick up the sphere. The protagonist also notices that his character wants to commit a rash act. However, the adventurer does not doubt his decision for a second. For Granfell Cloudy Arfie Romeo, wealth is fleeting. All the knights were in awe of the magnificent spectacle that appeared before their eyes. The blogger, who has been following the main character's adventures all this time, is also delighted. Romeo has been surrounded by luxury and wealth since childhood, so he does not understand what greed is. The guy easily manages to get the island's treasure without increasing the percentage of destruction. Another person was watching everything that was happening on the battlefield from afar. He looked more like a bandit than a player. The unknown man waited until the main character collected all the treasures. The man he had wounded cursed the man, promising to avenge the death of his comrades. But his words are not destined to come true, as an unknown person kills this man. The blood of an innocent person flows down a man's hand. For killing a player, he receives a boost in karma points. He takes back the crystal that was in the possession of the team he defeated and promises to do the same with Romeo's treasures. James, standing with a disgruntled expression on his face, looks like he is not too happy with what is happening. He notes with regret that the island's treasure does not look as impressive as he expected. But the main character's attention is drawn to the message that his team has been replenished. It turns out that Richard, as he had promised earlier, joined Romeo as a sign of gratitude for his salvation. The Lionheart commander was followed by his knights, who swore to stand by the brooch's owner while they were on Yusra Island. James hadn't expected Richard to go so far as to join him. He had assumed they would simply remain good acquaintances. The protagonist is amazed that the best knights in this world decided to follow him. The guy decides not to miss this chance and agrees to accept the Knights of the Lionheart into the team. All this time, a man whose name turns out to be Kinber continues to observe the players' conversations. He talks with his partners, who are not sure that they will be able to take the island's treasure from Romeo. But Kinber has no plans to retreat. His thirst for blood is stronger than his mind. The man wants to deal with the main character with poison, waiting for the moment when Romeo is completely defenseless. But the main character notices Kinber, his gaze directed straight to where the man is hiding. The eerie energy emanating from Romeo makes the bandit feel as if his throat has been cut in a split second. But this turns out to be just an illusion, which greatly frightens Kinber. At this time, an unsuspecting James admires the nature around him. Romeo is pleased to note that Commander Richard has a high position for a reason, and he also notices the unexpected guest. Richard asks the protagonist if they should deal with the rat hiding in the bushes. But Romeo doesn't think it's worth worrying about or wasting time on small-time bandits. During this time, guilds found treasures on several more islands, thereby increasing the destruction rate to 80%. He suggests that everyone rush to the last island to get ahead of the other factions. Kinber is left alone with his thoughts, which are confused in his head due to the horror he experienced. He understands that the protagonist spared him, and only thanks to this he is still alive. This is exactly what he tells his partners, who are waiting for new information from him. The head of the squad listens to Kinder's words and is perplexed as to why he so abruptly changed his position and decided to run away. The man smashes his phone out of anger, angry that he spent all his money on poison that he no longer needs. The leader of the squad is named Kiaran, and he is currently angry about the recent events. He pushes his subordinate, accusing him of also betraying himself. Kiaran believes that the rest of his group is also on Kinber's side, which makes him even more angry. His partners don't understand how their captain went crazy about money so quickly, but the anger only grew stronger, filling Kiaran's body with every second. At this time, the main character stopped in the middle of the road and looked to the side. The hunter's intuition told Romeo that the evil on the island had grown stronger, but he had not yet seen its causes. Kiaran increasingly loses control of his actions and begins to attack his comrades. His companions did not expect such betrayal from the captain. They die cursing him. The man kills one person after another. His cruelty knows no bounds. All these atrocities were observed by a blogger who was now horrified by what he saw. The demon took over Kiaran's body, completely absorbing his soul and forcing him to play by its rules. The blogger runs as fast as he can away from the place where many people were killed. He is immersed in his thoughts, so he does not notice the snag sticking out from under the ground. Luckily, a man who happens to be nearby manages to catch him. This stranger belongs to the Federation of Explorers. He invites the guy to relax with them. The blogger thanks them for saving him. He believes that he is safe with these people. Drones with cameras have already arrived on the last island to cover the outcome of the fight for the treasure. Reporters explain to their viewers that Yusra Island is divided into 10 islands, each of which contains its own treasure. There are 2 ways to get the reward. One of them is to defeat the owner of the island. But the second method is less bloodthirsty. You need to solve the island's riddle to get its treasure. The Shining Guild has already arrived at the last island to collect its reward. The Gaon clan, who did not plan to lose in this clash, came after them. The other guilds were also eager to finish clearing Yusra Island as quickly as possible. Suddenly, everyone gathered stopped talking to each other and froze in place. They were amazed that the Knights of the Lionheart, the most powerful warriors of the Empire, had come to the island. But what surprised everyone most was that Romeo was the leader of all these knights. James wasn't in the mood for such a violent reaction. He didn't want to attract the crowd's attention at all. It seemed to the guy that all people were looking at him either with contempt or with anger. Richard notices something strange in the surrounding reality, which makes him worry. Romeo also notices the Lionheart's commander's fear and turns his head towards the man. In front of them, lava began to flow out from under the ground, burning everything in its path. But after the fiery stream, the owner of the last island appeared from the pit. Kristoff prepared to fight back against the enormous monster, whose body was made entirely of lava. Richard isn't sure they'll be able to defeat such a difficult opponent to fight. However, Romeo asks the man not to worry. He already has a plan that will help them win. The protagonist begins to make passes with his hands, calling upon the magic of creation. The Shining Guild leader noticed that Romeo was smiling at such a dangerous moment. The protagonist begins to remember the basics of magic in order to correctly express his desire. At this time, the carp is already flying towards all the guilds, its body completely covered in fire. Everyone froze in anticipation of what the main character would do in his witchcraft. But they couldn't even imagine that Romeo was able to control lava, making it fly. Only Richard was ready for the main character's tricks and was already flying towards the monster. Samuel also came to his senses and began his swift attack on the owner of the island. The rest of the players followed them, wanting to deal with the monster as quickly as possible. But it's not for nothing that the owner of the island is one of the strongest creatures. He dodges all attacks by jumping in place. The guild's joint attack fails, but the next second, unknown objects fall from the sky. They attack the body of a huge carp, preventing it from continuing to move. These turn out to be stone spears that hit all the vital points of the monster. Everyone is amazed that Romeo is able to change the properties of matter since this magic requires too much energy. The protagonist asks to finish off the Lionheart's commander and the owner of the island. The man cuts the carp's body in half with one blow, thus ending the battle. All participants in this battle receive a notification that the battle is over. Everyone receives a reward for defeating the boss except for the Shining Guild, who did not have time to prove themselves in this battle. Reporters happily note that the biggest reward for the fight goes to the Knights of the Lionheart and Romeo. Meanwhile, the main character comes into possession of the island's treasure, which he takes without hesitation. But as soon as Romeo touches the sphere, the percentage of destruction immediately increases. James understands that he himself could not be the cause of this, Most likely, greed took possession of another treasure. On another part of Yusra Island, someone attacked the Explorers Federation. It turns out to be Kiaran, who took the island's treasure from the Federation. Inside himself, he tries to fight the demon that is increasingly beginning to consume him. The demon wants to take away everything he has desired for so long, and Kiaran will be his intermediary into this world. But suddenly the monster is attacked by a knight who attacks Kiaran with his blade. It turns out that this is a girl from the Knights of the Lionheart, who came to the aid of the Federation of Explorers. And Romeo came with her, who brought her here because he sensed a demon on the island of Yusra. The girl asks to give her an order so that she can deal with the monster. But the main character hesitates because a new class quest has opened up for him. The boy realizes that he has never encountered such a terrible enemy before. A deadly evil is emerging on the island of Yusra. The demon turns out to be so powerful that he destroys the island's treasure. And the protagonist's mission is updated now. Instead of saving the treasure, Romeo must stop the resurrection of greed. The others also felt the terrifying power emanating from the monster. Meanwhile, a huge hand with sharp claws rises from underground. Everyone watches in horror as this monster's actions change the landscape. The hand begins to unite all 10 islands into one large island. And in the very center of the new land, an unknown structure begins to appear. Richard watches what is happening in horror. It turns out he knows what kind of building has taken over the island. This beautiful castle, standing on the top of a hill, sparkles golden in the sun's rays like a precious treasure. The protagonist assumed that this palace was another treasure, but in fact, an evil entity named Greed resides in this building. Romeo finds that his class quest to save the island's treasure has been put on hold. Suddenly, other monsters begin to appear from underground, right where the players are standing. The undead are revealed to be under the control of the demon of greed, and they are now advancing to defeat the invaders. The reporters are also shocked by what is happening. One of the workers receives a notification on his phone. A man reads a message he received, and what he sees scares him. He runs to the Anti-Arcana Alliance to convince them to stop the guilds from fighting. The protagonist also reads the update message, which states that on Yusra Island, the appropriate level for combat is at least 600. The Lionheart's commander orders his chapter to hold its position. At this time, Romeo approaches him and asks Richard to support him. The main character talks about how he wants to start a battle with the demon of greed. And to do this, he needs the strength and power of the Knights of the Lionhearts, who have sworn to protect Romeo. Richard approves of the protagonist's plan, once again being convinced that the guy is strong physically and mentally. Only James is pessimistic about this battle. He understands that his mana has not yet fully recovered. The Lionheart's commander orders his order to go into battle against the undead. Everyone admires the extraordinary courage of Romeo and the brave knights who stand boldly in the face of danger. The soldiers were ready to die for the order of their commander and boldly went on the attack. The protagonist notes with satisfaction that the knights are not as weak as he assumed. Romeo is also pleased that his mana level has almost reached 100%. But while the main character was distracted, the undead sneaked up on him from behind. Romeo notices the monster too late. He only manages to take out his dagger. At this time, an unknown force is approaching them at greater speed. She quickly flies past the protagonist, leaving him with a feeling of incomprehension of what is happening. One unit of that energy that flew into the center of the battle turns out to be the head of the Gaona Guild. Along with Christoph, the head of the Berserker Guild arrives on the battlefield and defeats the undead that stand in her way. Such powerful players were followed by other travelers who wanted to get their hands on the island's treasures. James is thrilled to have such strong characters like Christoph and Ruby to help him. But Romeo does not share his creator's mood and is angry at the interference with his magic. James believes that the guy expressed his attitude too harshly, and his words could have offended Christoph and Ruby. Meanwhile, one of the Lionheart Knights notices that the undead he killed is starting to rise again. In the heat of battle, Christoph asks for the help of the priests to bless the knights. A bright white light suddenly appears in front of the armored man, illuminating the surrounding darkness and causing him to feel a strange sense of hope and excitement. These were the priests from the Gaon Guild who came on the orders of their leader to bless the knights against the fight against the undead. Soldiers begin to feel their physical performance improve, thereby raising their morale. Romeo thanks Guildmaster Gaona for helping him fight the undead, saying he will never forget it. When Christoph says he will help the protagonist with any additional defense skills, the guy claims that he does not believe in God. This greatly upsets Christoph, who had already decided that he had succeeded in winning Romeo's favor. At this time, in the heat of battle, a demon sneaks up on the Lionheart's commander. Richard was resonated with the protagonist's words about losing faith in God, which weakened the knight's vigilance. The man is increasingly drawn into the abyss of obsessions that the demon of greed shows him. Richard remembers himself in his youth, when he was still in the Empire at the Emperor's court. His Majesty sits on the throne in front of the man, silently listening to the knight's report. When Richard says that many new demons have appeared, the Emperor remarks with disappointment that many of his people will die in this battle. His Majesty recalls that with the disappearance of the magic tower and his subjects, the number of monsters has increased. Everything the Emperor owned disappeared from his lands in an instant, leaving behind only fragments. His Majesty does not understand why his world is destined to perish in such a terrible way, and why God has not answered his prayers. However, Richard claims that demons are to blame for blocking the path to the Lord. The Lionheart's commander vows that he and his order will rid the Empire of monsters. The Emperor asks to moderate Richard's ardor. He says that he no longer believes in God. These words surprise the man. This is not what he expected from his king. However, the Emperor smiles and says that despite the fact that he has lost faith in God, he still continues to believe in Richard's success. The man returns to reality. He remembers the mission the Emperor gave him. A demon named Legate appears before Richard, who is to blame for all the suffering of the human people. The Lionheart's commander, without a moment's hesitation, rushes to attack the demon. But this didn't frighten Legate. He says that Richard is too late and there is no point in resisting. Some of the Knights of the Order noticed a strange blue light behind them. The last thing Richard saw before he was teleported was the demon's terrifying face. The Lionheart's commander finds himself in the middle of a metropolis far from the rift. In Richard's place, his double remained, who was absorbed by the demon of greed. James noticed that the Lionheart's commander was emitting an ominous energy. The others also became wary, realizing that something was wrong with Richard. The man swings his sword, trying to deal with everyone who stands in his way. Romeo doesn't notice the Lionheart's commander's swift attack, leaving his life in danger at the moment. But fortunately, at the last moment, Christophe comes to his aid. But Romeo didn't want to be helped. He was unhappy with the intervention of the head of the Gaona Guild. Christophe had expected a completely opposite reaction to his actions and was now perplexed. Meanwhile, Richard continued to attack his subordinates, who were surprised by the commander's actions. The man was angry that the demons dared to pretend to be his comrades. Then the knights begin to realize that their commander is under the influence of some kind of witchcraft. Richard continues his attack, wanting to quickly deal with the demons in the area. James notices an unusual glow in front of him, which alarms him. At this time, Richard puts all his power into the blow in order to defeat as many of his supposed enemies as possible. The Lionheart's commander is determined and does not plan to leave anyone alive. His powerful blow has such destructive force that everything in his path is shattered into pieces. After such a release of energy, only scorched stones remain from the earth. Everyone miraculously survived this attack. The players were amazed by Richard's power. Christophe was also amazed at the strength of the Lionheart's commander, calling him a monster, not a man. When everyone had already recovered from the collision, they noticed an unusual picture. It was Romeo who stopped Richard's attack with just his palm. But the main character didn't do anything. He just tried to protect himself. In Richard's eyes, Romeo doesn't look like a demon. He asks the guy who he is. But the Lionheart's commander's patience is limited. He's already about to attack the main character. But Romeo asks the man to stop, as he has something to answer. Richard is not stopped by the protagonist's words. He plans to kill everyone who could be in any way connected to demons. Then Romeo extends his hand forward in a conciliatory gesture, thereby trying to stop the knight. Richard closely watches the movements of the protagonist. He notices a brooch from the magic tower on his chest. Memories of a recent meeting and how he swore to protect the owner of this brooch flashed before the knight's eyes. Romeo is pleased to note that Richard has come to his senses, as he sees a glimmer of consciousness in him. At the same time, the protagonist receives notifications that his exorcism skill has increased to level 2. While Romeo was reading about the new achievement, the demon of greed crept up behind him. He began to absorb the protagonist, trying to subjugate his will. However, all the demon managed to do was teleport Romeo into his consciousness. In front of the main character sat the demon himself, who looked more like pure evil than a man. The demon began his story about how he just wanted to protect his island of Yusra. He recalls that all the suffering of the inhabitants began with the appearance of a stranger on his territory. The king of the island and all the inhabitants treated the man who was thrown out of the ocean kindly. However, all the stranger did in return was to return to the island with weapons and kill the local population. In the end, the man reached the king of the island, Yusra, who did not understand such a robbery. He offered to divide the island's treasures with the stranger, to which he only laughed and said that half the treasures would not be enough for him. He wanted to get everything. The man's words caused the king of the peaceful island to sink into the abyss of hatred. As a result, he was consumed by anger and a thirst to reclaim all the island's treasures back into his possession. Romeo listened to the king's story and asked him to stop doing stupid things. The main character believes that money does not matter. The guy's words surprise the demon, but he is unwavering and does not intend to listen to Romeo. The protagonist claims that gold is fleeting. All that needs to be valued is the pride in the heart. The words, piercing the air like arrows, irritate the demon of greed, causing a storm of rage within him. Eventually, Romeo returns to reality, during which time the guy manages to understand what drives the monster. He gathers all his mana and begins to create magic in his palm. The protagonist directs energy towards the Golden Palace and begins to destroy the building. Such strong magic amazes everyone because not every player can do it. As a result, Romeo completely destroys the Golden Palace, turning it into sand. The protagonist summons the demon of greed, once again claiming that he is stupid since the jewels are so important to him. The demon appears before him, growing even larger and turning into a terrifying monster. He was very angry that a common man dared to attack one of the 7 sins. The demon's power was so great that it caused all players to lose the ability to move. At the same time, he also took away the ability to breathe, wanting to turn all the players into undead to protect the palace. The protagonist was enraged by the demon's behavior, telling him to moderate his desires. These words made the other players respect Romeo and his strength of spirit even more. But the main character's words had no effect on the demon of greed, they only made him laugh. Romeo will then activate his new skill called exorcism rite. The protagonist destroys the sphere, thereby releasing the power hidden within it. But the demon of greed is not so easily frightened. He begins his counterattack. At this moment, the king of the island of Yusra stops the monster's actions, saying that he has had enough of all this destruction. In the last moments of his life, the demon of greed curses the man for betrayal. All the reporters at this moment are delighted with the outcome of events on Yusra Island. A man appears before Romeo, whom he had already met in the demon's mind. The king does not understand how he is still alive if he clearly remembers his death. For defeating such a powerful enemy, the protagonist is inundated with trophy notifications, which he will have to sort through for a long time to come. One message that Romeo noticed was the notification that he had received the island's treasure in the form of a broken crown. Everyone was surprised when an unknown man appeared on the site of the destroyed palace. The protagonist took the island's crown from his vault and presented it to the king. When this accessory was placed on the man's head, memories began to come to him. Romeo received another golden notice that the secret of Yusra Island had been solved. The other adventurers who participated in the battle also received this message, and even those who had no idea about this battle and were on the other side of the world were also informed. Thus, the victory of the protagonist over the demon of greed marked the emergence of a lost territory in Arcanum. In place of the destroyed Golden Palace, a new castle shone again, which no longer seemed so ominous. Everyone began to understand that the changes were happening thanks to the man from this island. It was the last king of the lost kingdom of Yusra, named Akuna. Players who were present during this global change in the world were shocked by what happened. And at this time, Akuna bowed before Romeo and called him his benefactor. The main character took these words from the king's lips lightly and told him his name. Everyone was amazed at Romeo's impudence, because before him stood his majesty, and not a simple man. But Akuna didn't pay attention to the protagonist's rudeness. He only promised that he would remember the savior's name forever. The king recalls Romeo's words about how it was time for him to stop spreading evil on earth, and he claims that it was these words that made him begin to resist the demon. Akuna was grateful to the protagonist for a second chance, but he wasn't sure he could bear the burden of responsibility again. At this time, players from the Second Sun Guild fled to the site of the recent battle. The leader named Karl realized that the rich kingdom he had read about was the island of Yusra. Akuna continued to think about his next move. He wasn't sure if people would follow him again. Romeo seemed to sense the king's worries, so he said that he would help in the restoration of the island of Yusra. Akuna was deeply grateful to his benefactor for his support. The main character only said such supportive words because it was part of his assignment. After talking with Romeo, the king decided to announce to everyone that he planned to restore the kingdom of Yusra from ruins. At this moment, adventurers from the Second Sun Guild come running, wanting to meet with the king. Karl is glad that Akuna decided to resurrect the island. He's sure that this is a good idea since it is a land quite rich in resources. Filled with inspiration, the head of the Second Sun Guild runs up to the protagonist to greet him. But Romeo is clearly not very happy about his personal space being so rudely invaded. Karl also felt the oppressive atmosphere from the main character. He realized that he had made a mistake. It turns out that Romeo already wanted to rest and almost fell asleep, and the man disturbed his peace. Carl tried to smooth things over. He started with a story about himself in order to soften the protagonist's heart. But Romeo did not want to listen to him. He wanted to quickly finish his business on the island and leave it. The protagonist turns to the king and says that he has a proposition for him. Sometime later, Romeo was sitting in his office, and Jessie, who had learned etiquette during this time, came to visit him. But the main character didn't really appreciate her efforts and asked why she came. Jessie began asking Romeo about his abilities and how he defeated the demon. However, the protagonist had spent too much mana during the fight and was now so exhausted that he fell asleep while sitting in a chair. Jessie noticed this and froze in place, not wanting to wake the adventurer. She moved closer to Romeo to make sure he was really asleep. The girl, as if with a light touch of a feather, lightly touched the closed eyelids of the protagonist, creating a moment of tenderness and mystery in the air. The next moment, Romeo wakes up and cannot understand how long he has been sleeping. He notices that Jessie is missing, leaving behind a note saying she would come see him later. Immediately after the protagonist reads the note, a notification about a new quest appears in front of him, which states that he must gain the trust of 20 senior mages. There was a knock on Romeo's office door. It was Marcel who came and wanted to talk to the main character. But he was surprised that the adventurer had already guessed the purpose of the chief magician's visit. Marcel is convinced that the main character was given this task due to the weakness of the magician himself. But Romeo convinced the chief magician that he was not to blame for what happened, and that he should not worry. The senior magicians had already gathered at the meeting and had prepared a treacherous test for the protagonist. Romeo approached the place where the meeting was to be held, but at first he did not notice anyone. It turns out that the senior mages enchanted the entrance door with third-level sealing magic. Romeo was already about to move away from the place where the senior magicians were hiding, but Romeo's strength allowed him to easily solve this riddle. All the assembled senior mages were amazed by the protagonist's ability. Even Marcel would have needed more time to open the door. Romeo confidently walked into the auditorium where the meeting was to take place. He was furious that the magicians dared to take so much of his time for their whim. The protagonist angrily approached one of the senior magicians, expecting to hear an explanation. But Romeo was so exhausted that he fell asleep standing up, frightening the girl even more. The protagonist found the strength to continue the conversation. He said that only this time would he forgive such rudeness towards himself. The other mages were also amazed by Romeo's strength. They themselves were not sure that they could break a sealing spell of such power. One of the senior mages remembered that he had already heard about the white-haired youth who came to a recent event without an invitation. The girl also heard the words of her colleague. Now she began to understand why Marcel trusted Romeo. Meanwhile, the protagonist returned to his office and discovered that during his recent meeting with the magicians, he had managed to win the trust of 3 sorcerers. This upset Romeo a little, but all he could think about now was going to bed as quickly as possible. The protagonist begins to reflect on the fact that this was, after all, a good start. He decides to get some sleep and then sort out the treasures he has obtained from Yusra Island. Suddenly, the main character notices a piece of parchment on the table, which also speaks. It turns out that this is the voice of Marcel, who communicates with Romeo in this way. This innovation in the world of magicians surprises the main character. He doesn't understand at all how to use it. After several unsuccessful attempts, Romeo throws the parchment into the urn. But Marcel does not plan to leave the main character. He wants to apologize for the rudeness of the senior magicians. The magician explains that other sorcerers are used to constantly proving their strength, which is why they behave this way, and they can still trust Romeo because they underestimate his strength. Marcel's last words made James worry because his character doesn't know how to lose. And indeed, Romeo, upon hearing that he was being underestimated, immediately changed his face and a smile appeared on it. The adventurer said with confidence in his voice that if you are underestimated, then you just have to make sure that they overestimate you. Marcel realized that he too had been rude to Romeo by trying to apologize to him through parchment, so he plans to visit the protagonist in person. Romeo tried to stop the chief magician, but he was unwavering in his decision. Immediately after the conversation, the protagonist again began to think about a new quest for him to gain the support of senior mages. In his thoughts, Romeo began to cast spells. He understood that his level was still not equal to that of the great sorcerers. However, the main character was able to instantly change his magic to a completely different one without much effort. James did not appreciate Romeo's actions, calling him a proud, tyrant count. At that moment, Marcel entered the protagonist's office, rushing to personally apologize to the adventurer. Romeo's expression immediately changed. He considered this skill to be another of his talents. Upon entering, the chief mage noticed a huge residual trace of mana that the protagonist had left behind while playing with magic. Claire came up behind him, also amazed by the beauty in the room. The other senior magicians also wanted to look at this beautiful trace of magic. They thought that Marcel was involved in this miracle. But the chief magician began to deny the false assumptions and said that Romeo had created all of this. But when Marcel turned to the place where the main character had recently been sitting, he discovered that it was already empty. Meanwhile, Romeo tried to run away from this tower to where he could rest. However, even here his path was blocked by other wizards, who were also delighted with the main character's abilities. They challenged him to solve a riddle that only became more difficult with the use of magic. Romeo solved the puzzle in a second by casting an anti-magic spell, leaving the mages in shock. The protagonist calmly descended the stairs, analyzing the task he had been given. It turned out that 7 magicians already trusted the adventurer. But even here, Romeo's path is blocked by reporters who want to know everything about what happened on Yusra Island and the guy's opinion on the dispute about his abilities. James also notices that on the other side, their way was blocked by magicians who wanted to learn more about Romeo's magic. Luckily for himself, the protagonist notices that the door next to him seems to have come to life. Having no other choice, he immediately passes through, leaving people in the dark. When the main character goes through the magic, he notices that there is a girl sitting in the office. Romeo recalls seeing her earlier at a meeting of senior mages where she was performing her duties. The sorceress is amused by the protagonist's words that he can easily control magic. The girl introduces herself as Julia, a senior mage at the School of Healers, and she admits that they underestimated Romeo's abilities, thereby increasing the quest completion percentage. The protagonist returned home, began reading about the controversy that had erupted on the internet, and discovered that he didn't have much to worry about. During this time, Romeo continued to clean the apartment and was still completing his physical activity tasks. James is pleased to discover that the basic quests have greatly increased his strength and stamina, but he understands that physical attributes alone will not be enough, and that it would be a good idea to learn a skill that will be useful in close combat. While James was thinking about this, his character miscalculated his strength while cooking and cut the table. Along with the table, Romeo almost destroyed the entire apartment by using magic inside the house. At the same time, the Berserker Guild took part in the restoration of the Yusra Kingdom. Guildmaster Ruby was watching videos online that clearly didn't make her happy. She listened to the live broadcast, where everyone was discussing the recent events on Yusra Island. After watching several videos like this, Ruby became furious that ignorant people were picking apart moments from the battle. Her little sister came up to her to calm the girl down. She noticed that Ruby was so worried because many people were against Romeo. The Berserk Guildmaster's sister suggests that Ruby has fallen in love with the protagonist, but the girl denies everything. The adventurer is thinking that after completing a task for the Yusra Kingdom, relations with them will improve. Then she doesn't understand why Romeo entrusted such a useful task to her guild. After relaxing at home, the protagonist decided to visit Yusra Island for personal reasons. He approached the border of the kingdom, where soldiers were already stationed, and asked to meet with the commander of Lionheart. The young man rather rudely answered the protagonist that he did not have the authority to meet with Richard. Luckily for Romeo, King Akuna was nearby and noticed the boy at the entrance to the island's territory. The king was very glad to meet his benefactor. He asked about the reason for the protagonist's visit to the kingdom. Romeo said he had planned to meet Richard, but apparently he needed to get entry clearance first. King Akuna was surprised by the protagonist's words, as he believed that the adventurer had the same right to enter as he did. After the king's words, the guards let Romeo through and escorted him to the commander of the Order of the Lionheart. Richard did not expect to meet the protagonist so soon. He asked the adventurer about the purpose of his visit, to which he received a response asking him to teach him how to wield the sword's energy. At these words, the man only exhaled and told Romeo that it would take at least 10 years to master this technique. However, the main character did not plan to look for easy ways. He was confident that training would not take him much time. Richard sensed the seriousness of Romeo's intentions, so he agreed to help the adventurer. He asked his subordinate to bring them his sword and the so-called lion's oath. The girl got everything she needed, so now Romeo was standing in front of a large iron plate with a lion depicted on it. Richard explains that the relic his subordinate brought is made of very strong iron and is very difficult to cut. He offers Romeo his sword so that he can use it to swear an oath to the Order of the Lionhearts, making another mark on the plate. However, the protagonist did not accept Richard's weapon, saying that he could not take it. Instead, Romeo walked over to the rack of practice swords and pulled out one. The protagonist approached the relic on which he needed to make another notch. Romeo unleashes his power and channels it into his sword to cut through the tough material with one blow. The Lionheart Knights are shocked that the protagonist was able to deliver such a powerful blow with a simple training sword. Richard was amazed at the potential that Romeo had hidden within himself all this time. He suggested that the main character first master the basics of swordsmanship. His mentors would be the commander's subordinates, a girl named Edith and a guy named Derek. Romeo had nothing against getting into better physical shape. Derek was still pondering the protagonist's strength. He couldn't believe what he had just seen. Meanwhile, Edith had already begun training, demonstrating her first sword technique. Romeo had already changed into the Order's training uniform and picked up a sword. He began to try to imitate Richard's technique, which he had seen in the recent fight. The protagonist struck with such force that he tousled the hair of his mentors. The commander of the Lionheart watched all this and noted with satisfaction that Romeo was even stronger than he could have imagined. King Akuna also came to watch the training, knowing that the main character would be there. His Highness noticed Romeo's strength, but he could not allow the protagonist's lungs to be damaged. So Richard immediately ordered his knights to clean up the beach. King Akuna also continued to express his concern for the protagonist, saying that it was too sunny during training. Then the Lionheart commander ordered his knights to create more shade on the beach. Richard was amazed at how committed the king was to training, so he also decided to join her to remember his youth. Edith and Derek were terrified that they would have to train with the commander, as they knew that Richard would not let them go until they were all exhausted. The Lionheart commander invited Romeo to study with him, to which the protagonist replied that he did not mind. The training continued with the addition of another high-ranking person. At this time, in the Magician's Tower, one of the sorcerers was sitting in his office and filling out paperwork. It was a stately man with long black hair, the senior magician of the School of Sorcerers, Matisse Dean Carl. One of his subordinates came to see him and assess the items given to him by Romeo. Matisse listened carefully to the magician. He was surprised that one person could own a large number of rare artifacts. It was already late. The moon was shining in the sky, and the training was only now coming to an end. Everyone had already gone to bed to recover as quickly as possible, but the main character continued to carry out his daily mission to increase his physical strength. Suddenly an owl flies to him, bringing parchment in its claws. It turns out to be the senior mage of the School of Sorcerers, Matisse, who wants to tell the protagonist the value of his things. He talks about the cost of each item brought in for evaluation. Romeo says that he wants his silk and emerald crystal to be made into a useful item, to which Matisse replies that they can charge a large sum for production, but the main character doesn't care about the cost. The result is important to him. After this, Romeo considered the conversation over and went to bed, but the sorcerer had one more request, so he left a note for the adventurer. At dawn, Romeo woke up full of strength and energy, as if there had been no long training session yesterday. While jogging, the protagonist notices that the owl is flying towards him again with parchment. It turns out to be Matisse again, who wanted an answer to the note he left, inviting Romeo to meet him tomorrow in the floating garden. The protagonist listened to the sorcerer and noted that he had not seen any note, and in any case, he could not come to the meeting place at this time. Matisse had not expected to receive a refusal to his proposal, so he was now somewhat discouraged. However, Romeo still agreed to meet the sorcerer in 2 days when he plans to finish his training. The protagonist changed back into his training uniform to continue his training. Richard approached him to announce that Romeo had successfully mastered the basics of sword energy control, and he offered the protagonist to imbue the sword with aura. Romeo is not entirely confident in his abilities. He has only trained for 1 day. But still, the main character takes his new sword in his hands and stands in a stance. He feels a flow of energy in his body that is different from magical power and successfully uses this power. Richard claims that thanks to the protagonist's hard work, he was able to master the new technique in 1 day. With passion in his eyes, he invites Romeo to follow him along the path of the sword. But the protagonist does not plan to stop at mastering just one technique. He believes that he must follow his own path. Edith had been watching Romeo's abilities all this time and was now sad that she was not as capable. The girl believes that she is still far from the level of mastery of the sword aura of the main character or her commander. But Edith is not going to give up so easily. She will continue to train even harder. She infects Derek with her passion for the business, and now they will move forward rapidly together. Richard notes with satisfaction that Romeo's presence at the training session greatly raised the spirits of all the knights. The main character has already changed into his suit, and now he is going to practice his new technique on real enemies. A leopard with a silver mane, whose level reaches 300, emerges from behind the trees in front of him. Romeo's natural enemy skill activates, and he is now unhappy that the monster has shown him disrespect. In this same forest, the leader of the shadow mercenaries, Kitch, was looking for her comrades. She noticed that the adventurer had encountered the field boss of Yusra Island. But Kitch doesn't plan to help the main character, since it's in her best interest to keep the leopard busy and out of her team's way. She heads towards the kingdom of Yusra to keep her promise to the mercenaries. James is terrified that his first opponent in a real fight will be such a dangerous monster. The guy imagines that as soon as he moves, the leopard will tear him to pieces. But Romeo is not at all intimidated by the monster standing in front of him. He decides that now is the time to show what he has learned. The leopard rushes at the main character with all its speed, wanting to bite off a piece of his flesh. James was just beginning to think that his adventures with his character were over. But in the end, he notices something strange about the monster. Romeo activates the sword's aura, as he did before during training, and it turns out that the leopard was a strong and slow opponent. Therefore, the main character finishes the fight with one blow of the sword. Romeo tries to pretend that this fight is too easy for him, but James understands that it was a physically difficult fight. Matisse is already waiting for the main character in the hovering garden at the appointed time. Romeo arrives on time. He tries to walk with his head held high, but you can see how his body is shaking from the strain. The sorcerer introduces himself again, mentally admiring the protagonist's strength. Romeo is also polite, trying to ignore the pain in his muscles. He recalls that after defeating the silver-haired leopard, he fought several more monsters. Suddenly, Matisse's rings, which react to black magic, begin to shimmer very brightly in Romeo's presence. The sorcerer encounters such a rich purple color for the first time. It's scary to even think about what dark past the main character is hiding. Matisse recalls his past. When he was just learning magic, his passion for black magic was not respected at school. But the sorcerer continued to practice stubbornly, because he wanted to prove to everyone the value of this magic. Eventually, Matisse succeeds in reviving the skeleton of a living creature, and he shows his results at a conference of magicians. Everyone was horrified by what the guy had come to. Only the dean supported the sorcerer's hobbies. Matisse was pleasantly surprised that the dean responded positively to the new magic. The man asked the sorcerer what he wanted to call the new movement, to which the sorcerer replied that he would call this magic black magic. Only a few years had passed since the new school was founded, but the research had not yielded any results. Matisse came to the conclusion that he could not achieve great heights in black magic alone. And now, before the senior mage of the School of Sorcerers, stood Romeo, whose ability to use black magic frightened the wizard. The protagonist sat down at the table in the garden with relief. He showed interest in Matisse's rings. The sorcerer happily told Romeo that his rings were sensitive to black magic, thereby helping to measure the potential of mastering this type of magic. Matisse demonstrated ordinary magic, saying that it was a power that was expressed through observing and interfering with magical activity. In his other hand, the sorcerer showed black magic that uses a person's inner darkness. Matisse once again imagined all the horrors that the main character could have experienced in the past. But Romeo, after listening to the sorcerer, only remarked that it was impolite to judge a person's past at the first meeting. Matisse immediately became embarrassed and apologized to the protagonist for his inappropriate behavior. Romeo accepted the sorcerer's apology and became interested in another direction of magic, as black magic could be used at the moment when mana was exhausted. Matisse latched onto the protagonist's words and suggested that he follow the path of black magic. The protagonist noted with surprise that another person had joined the ranks of senior mages who recognized the player. As soon as the meeting with Matisse ended, Romeo went to his office, telling the sorcerer that he would contact him later. In his laboratory, the protagonist again received a magical parchment for remote conversation. These messages were from several senior mages, and James is pleased to note that they successfully completed the task of gaining recognition. Only the joy is softened by an unexpected in-game notification that a new feature is available. At the same time, people were discussing the emergence of a new kingdom, Yusra. Guildmaster Gaon and his brother watched the live broadcast and discussed the latest events. Christophe was grateful to the protagonist for allowing them to take part in the reconstruction of the kingdom, which allowed them to rise from 5th place in the ranking to 3rd. Jack started reading the comments under the video and noticed a message about people being disappointed with their refusal to cooperate with the Myth Guild. Christophe was furious that this clan had bribed the press here too. In another part of the city, someone was sucking the life energy out of a man. It was the head of the Myth Guild, named Aida, who was currently talking to her secretary. And at the same time, the girl watched her new toy in the person of the main character. Overexcited, she revealed her true form as a demon and prepared to head to the kingdom of Yusra. Romeo was distracted from checking out the new feature by a notification on his phone. His sisters were discussing their brother's heroic behavior. Suddenly, The magical parchment from the tower falls into his hands again. Several wizards at once decided to ask Romeo to join their research. But the main character did not intend to get involved in the affairs of the magic tower, so he quickly escaped from it. Now he was next to King Akuna, having a pleasant conversation and a cup of tea. His Highness was greatly amused by Romeo's story of how he sought peace on an island from the wizards in a magic tower. Suddenly, the main character receives a notification that someone is calling him. It was the sister who was unhappy with James risking his life. The other sisters were happy about the main character's popularity, and they told him about it. Romeo can't handle the pressure that falls on him, so he hangs up, after thanking his sisters for their support and concern for him. King Yusra gave the main character one of the new houses on the island. Romeo returned home. He wanted to rest, but before that it was worth checking the news. Suddenly, the main character notices something unpleasant that worries him greatly. It turns out that there is a lot of dust in this house, which Romeo cannot stand. Meanwhile, at the temporary headquarters of the Gaon Guild on Yusra Island, Kristoff was trying to figure out why his clan's shares had dropped by several %. He believes that the reason for this decline was the Myth Guild, which he had previously refused to cooperate with. While Kristoff was cursing the actions of his enemies, Ada approached him from behind. Guildmaster Gaon didn't notice her right away, but he wasn't pleased with the unexpected meeting. Jack ran to find out how their guards could have let Ada through, but unfortunately for himself, he discovered that all the people were unconscious. This attitude infuriated him, as this incident could lead to a guild war. In response to these words, Ada began to use her abilities, influencing Jack's mind. Kristoff also did not stand aside. He demanded that the girl stop her manipulations. At this time, Jack tried to understand the source of Ada's power. He wanted to warn his brother, but he could not move. The protagonist approached the temporary camp of the Gaon Guild and noticed unconscious people lying in front of the entrance. Luckily, the guild dispute was stopped when Romeo entered the tent. The main character felt that a demon had appeared on the island, which is why he came here. Romeo shows the video that Ada ordered to be uploaded to the internet and calls the girl a demon. These words amuse the head of the Myth Guild. She is glad that the adventurer came to her himself, since she initially planned to get information through the Gaon clan. Ada approaches Romeo, using all her charm to capture the boy's mind. But the main character is a difficult person, so such spells do not work on him, and he easily manages to resist the girl. Romeo asked Jack to explain to him about the video he had shown earlier. The guy said that this was an attempt by the Gaon Guild to counter the false rumors that the main character only gives preference to guilds close to him. Romeo listens attentively to Jack, while Ada recovers from the shock of being rejected. The girl demands that the protagonist explain his dismissive behavior towards her. Romeo was also angry that his conversation with Jack was interrupted in such a rude manner. Ada tries to use her succubus powers on the protagonist once again. When the girl touches Romeo, the guy unexpectedly discovers the activation of the natural enemy skill, so he realizes that the girl is not quite human. Ada is saved from full disclosure by the fact that bloggers, who learned of her presence on the island, broke into her room. This was Jack's plan in action. Fortunately, he caught the girl off guard. Romeo also didn't like the large number of bloggers in such a small space. Ada suggested that the protagonist go to a more secluded place where they could be alone, to which Romeo categorically replies no. Since he does not go to unplanned meetings, the guy suggests that Ada learn etiquette and only then offer to meet him. The girl did not expect to be rejected, as this had never happened to her before. People on the internet began to criticize Ada, thereby destroying her image of the ideal woman. Ada looked up and was met with her demonic reflection. The succubus offered the girl help in dealing with all these people on the internet. But Ada is trying to resist the one who has been a part of her all this time. The girl believes that all this time the demon inside her has only been bothering her, and it's time to end her suffering. Ada regains control of her body and holds the shard of glass to her throat. The succubus tries to resist the girl's desire to kill herself. She tries to stop the bleeding. The real Ada begins to understand that everything she has achieved in this life is not thanks to the demon's efforts, so she no longer sees the point in obeying him. The girl tries to weaken the succubus even more, so she sticks a shard of glass into her stomach. She remembers her recent meeting with Romeo and his gaze looking straight at her. Ada realizes that the protagonist is the only person who has seen the real her. In the end, he even said goodbye to her, and not to the demon, promising to meet again. The succubus also saw Ada's memories, and the demon realized that Romeo was to blame for all the changes in the girl's consciousness. In order to save her physical shell, the succubus, having taken possession of the body again, runs out of the bathroom where she meets the guard. The demon sucks out the man's life energy to restore his strength. Sometime later, Romeo discovers at home that his natural enemy skill has activated again. The protagonist, filled with determination, is ready to face the uninvited guest, prepared for any trials and challenges. It turns out it was Ada, who unexpectedly entered his house through an open window. Romeo expected the girl to enter his door, and now he was dissatisfied with the guest's lack of manners. Ada feigned apology to the protagonist and reproached him for inviting her himself. Looking at the girl, Romeo noticed that the shadow of the real Ada had disappeared, and now only her demonic face remained. The main character asked the guest exactly about this, to which she replied that she was here. The demon tells that Ada died when she wanted to resist her. The succubus tells about the girl's childhood, about how she is the illegitimate daughter of the chairman of Manhwa, a large company in the city. When Ada was 8 years old, everyone learned about her existence through an article on the internet. From then on, the girl began to be bullied. First in elementary school and then in high school, everyone considered her dirty. But when Ada was finishing school, her mother died, and her father, the chairman of Manhwa, took in his daughter. The succubus continues to tell the story of how the man forced his child to work without rest when the girl suddenly became a gambler. What Ada wanted most was to earn her father's recognition, and when her guild became successful, she succeeded. Romeo listened attentively to the succubus's story. The demon's words angered the guy. The look the demoness saw from the protagonist made her fall silent with fear. Romeo was angry that the succubus dared to speak to him in such a tone. The demoness was too weak in spirit, so she lost to the main character. Suddenly, James was flooded with a jumble of memories that made him listen more closely to his feelings. The guy was standing in some large room that was expensively furnished. He noticed Romeo running up to his relatives and showing them his work. Suddenly, James felt a pain in his chest, as if someone was squeezing his heart from the inside. The boy realizes that he has entered Romeo's mind. Only now the boy has grown up. James watches Romeo's memories, in which everyone he once loved was killed. It was these memories that marked the beginning of Romeo making the killing of demons his main goal in life. The succubus was so afraid of the main character's power that she couldn't even move. She suddenly fell to her knees before her enemy, begging him for mercy, her voice a soft whisper in the darkness. But instead of killing the demon, Romeo leaned towards the girl, trying to awaken the consciousness of the real Ada. Luckily, he succeeds, because the next second it is a man looking at him, not a demon. Romeo didn't want to listen to Ada's tearful stories, so he asked her to go home immediately when he realized that the girl had finally come to her senses. However, due to the strain, Ada immediately lost consciousness, and at the last moment the main character managed to catch her. Immediately after everything happened, the Knights of the Order of the Lionheart came running, because they also sensed demonic energy in the player's house. They arrived just as Romeo was laying Ada on the bed, and the Knights misunderstood the guy's intentions. The adventurer tried to explain himself to the people who entered. He said that he had simply covered the girl with a blanket. But Edith asked Romeo not to justify himself to them. He had the right to a private life. When everyone left the main character's house, the guy was finally able to be in silence, which he had been lacking lately. But as soon as the main character sits down on the couch, he immediately receives a notification about a new class assignment. At the same time, a message arrives at the development headquarters about the opening of a new area, the northern city of Frost. This news quickly spread throughout the internet and television, and everyone started discussing it. James is horrified to discover that his new class quest involves defeating the Demon King. The guy wanted to immediately tell the entire internet about it, to share this news with everyone. At this time, Romeo remembers his past, when he was just starting his path as a demon hunter. His mentor gives him a book of all known demon kings and insists that the boy memorize them all, as there are not many who survive an encounter with even the weakest king. After the article was published online, James lost interest in it, feeling he had done all he could to inform players. A green bird flies into the main character's house, distracting the guy from his thoughts. It turns out that it is a messenger from the magic tower. He delivered new things to Romeo that were made to his order. The first thing the adventurer does is take an emerald ring from his bag, which restores vitality when taking damage. At this point, James remembers that Romeo didn't specify the maximum price for all the things, so the guy frantically tries to check his account balance. The next item Romeo takes out of his bag is a koi scale scarf, which, under certain conditions, helps avoid damage and, in addition, unlocks the new aesthetic stat for the guy. This piece sparkles so brightly that its light fills the entire room, almost waking up Ada, who is fast asleep. The value of this scarf cannot be measured, and its cost could exceed billions. So Romeo took a liking to the item. James decided to spend all the free skill points he got after defeating the succubus on increasing his luck level. The last item Romeo takes out of his bag is a gift from Marcel in the form of a vest, which perfectly matches the new scarf. The next second, the protagonist discovers a new notification that postpones his mission to kill the Demon King. At the same time, at the Inazuma Guild headquarters, a man is being scolded for losing his place in the rankings. The chairman demands that the clan's level be returned to its previous levels, to which Guildmaster Trent promises to do everything possible. The man's plan is to secure a foothold in the new location, Frost City, before other guilds arrive before them. Trent ignores his subordinates who ask him not to get into trouble. He says that he will bypass the Gaon Guild at any cost. The adventurer orders the entire guild to gather in Frost City as soon as possible. The other guilds also received notification about the opening of the new location and began to gather. The Frost City area is home to a large number of shops and forges that can help players improve their skills. Only a new location appeared on the site of Hokkaido, which was filled with a large amount of military equipment. Christoph of the Gaon Guild had already arrived at the new territory, but armed police officers blocked his entrance to the portal. Jack tried to figure out the situation, but without a passport, he couldn't enter Hokkaido. Meanwhile, people from the Inazuma Guild had already made their way into the territory and were now approaching the city gates. Suddenly, the adventurer notices something strange in front of him and stops the entire group. A terrible picture opened up before them. The whole ground was covered in blood from the bodies of murdered people. While the guild members were looking around the new territory, a demon approached them from behind and began devouring people. Trent froze in horror. He didn't expect this location to be so dangerous. The story returns a few hours back to the protagonist's house on Yusra Island. After a long sleep, Ada wakes up in bed and still cannot understand where she is. As soon as the girl notices Romeo in the room, she immediately jumps out of bed. Ada quietly approaches the main character, who all this time was reading a new task to save people in the city of Frost. Romeo wanted to hurry to go to the new territory, but noticed that the girl had already woken up. Ada wanted to thank her savior, so the protagonist wanted to offer her to pay the bill from the magic tower. But when James opened the envelope, he discovered that he had received all of these items completely free of charge. There was another knock on the door of the protagonist's house. This time, it was Richard. The Knights of the Lionheart accompanied King Akuna because he had a conversation with Romeo. Ada also decided to introduce herself to His Majesty and the commander of the order, since they had not met before that moment. Everyone greeted the girl in return and said that she was even more beautiful in real life. The king had a request for the protagonist. He wanted him to deal with an Arcanian who had illegally entered the territory of Yusra Island. Romeo immediately realized that Akuna was talking about Ada, who had indeed entered the kingdom illegally. He asked that at the next meeting, on behalf of the Myth Guild, monetary compensation be prepared for the island. The girl was glad that she would meet the main character again, while the adventurer was already getting ready to leave. Everyone present was amazed that Romeo was getting ready to go somewhere so quickly. The protagonist did not deceive his comrades. He honestly admitted that a demon king was raging in the city of Frost. Christoph tried to negotiate with the border guards to let them into the new location, but Guildmaster Gayan was already losing his little patience. The adventurer is stopped from squabbling with the military by the newly arrived members of the Shining Guild. Samuel threatened a military world conflict, as their actions violate the rules of the player organization. The words of the head of the Shining Guild had a beneficial effect on the border guards, as they immediately began to remove the barricades. But Samuel's joy was shattered by new news about what was happening in the city of Frost. The Inazuma Guild's defensive ranks were rapidly thinning. They were unable to cope with the onslaught of demons. And so, in the end, the monster reached Trent, promising him a martyr's death. But fortunately for him, the main character comes to his aid, using his magical abilities. He and Christoph cut the demon in half, thereby saving Trent's life. The adventurer was already ready to die, but now he was trying to understand who the people were who saved him. Trent recognizes Christoph. He does not understand why he helped him, since they were enemies, to which the head of the guild, Gaon, tells Trent to thank Romeo for saving him. The protagonist stands on a mountain with the Knights of the Order of the Lionheart. At his command, everyone advanced to attack the demons, filled with determination and fearlessness, ready to fight to the end for their ideals and protect their world from evil. The Lionheart Knights were one of the strongest members of the Arcana Empire. Romeo was angry that the demons dared to humiliate human pride. Everyone is in awe of the appearance of their savior. His presence fills their hearts with hope and faith in the victory of good over evil. Richard is once again amazed by the protagonist's courage, as he is not afraid to go to the most terrible place to help the weak. Meanwhile, Romeo reflects on the fact that he was in such a hurry to get to Frost City because the number of survivors on the mission was rapidly declining. The story returns to a few hours ago, When King Akuna listened to the protagonist, he asked the adventurer to stay on the island until the army was gathered. The Lionheart commander agreed with the king because he also thought it was a dangerous idea. But Romeo stood his ground. His highest desire was to punish the demon. Such courage once again amazed Richard, filling his heart with pride and admiration for the courage and determination of the protagonist. He said that he would follow Romeo to help him retake Frost City. Akuna agreed with the Lionheart commander that it would be safer for the benefactor of Yusra Island. But Romeo couldn't allow the king's protection to be weakened, so he abandoned the idea. Ada observed this conversation and said that she would take care of the kingdom's safety. Akuna agreed with her, so Romeo could advance with the Order of the Lionheart. Trent wants to know from Guildmaster Gaon who the protagonist is and why he should be grateful to him. Kristoff replies that it was Romeo who insisted that saving the survivors in Frost was a priority. Trent despaired that even a simple adventurer valued his life and the lives of his comrades above the government of his country that had sent them here. Romeo noted with satisfaction that the Knights of the Order of the Lionheart were not called the strongest knights of the Empire for nothing, and they successfully fought against the demons. The protagonist decided that the battle near the City of Frost was coming to an end, and it was time to go inside. Romeo, gathering his inner strength and concentrating, resorts to magic. The Shining Guild was also approaching the city when Samuel noticed a strange energy. He remembered that before leaving, he read an article on the internet that caught his attention. It said that a demon king lived in the City of Frost, and these were the words spoken by the main character when exiting the portal. The blogger also quickly ran towards the new location to get a closer look at the events of this battle. But all conversations stopped when they noticed the magical trail that Romeo left behind after his magic. Everyone was amazed that one person could create such a large number of water droplets. Romeo, using his magic that focused on the elements of nature, froze the castle. Jessie also watched the protagonist's magic. The only thing that upset her was that this beauty would not last long. From such a brutal impact, the wooden gates of the castle collapsed with a crash. All participants in this battle received a notification about a new task in which they had to free the City of Frost from the Demon King. Richard admired the protagonist's abilities. He had never seen such a magnificent siege. The commander of the Lionheart Order said that he would follow Romeo, but the adventurer was alarmed by the increasing amount of evil energy emanating from the city. Kristoff also expressed his respect to the main character. He was about to go on the offensive, but Romeo asked him to stop, as his sense of danger was only growing. And indeed, while Kristoff was distracted from the city walls, a large number of demons emerged from them, each of which was no less dangerous than the monsters he had encountered up to that point.